Good morning. I call this hearing to order. We have sufficient members to be able to take testimony, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. The committee procedures for remote hearings remain the same. If you are experiencing connectivity issues, please make sure you or your staff contact our designated technical support so those issues can be resolved immediately. If you wish to have a document inserted into the record, please ask for unanimous consent and have your staff email the documents to veteransaffairs.hearings@mail.house.gov. Without objection, members will be recognized in order of seniority for questioning witnesses today. This will make it easier for me to ensure all members participating have an opportunity to be recognized. Does any member have a question about the procedures for this hearing? Hearing none, we will proceed. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today's oversight hearing is entitled Helping Veterans Thrive: The Importance of Peer Support in Preventing Domestic Violent Extremism. Last fall, this committee held an initial hearing examining the threat of veteran radicalization and recruitment by domestic violent extremist groups. We learned why violent extremist groups such as the Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, and Three Percenters target veterans in their recruitment efforts. Some of the reasons for this may seem obvious. These groups value the leadership skills, the combat experience, and the weapons training that veterans possess. Having veterans among their ranks also gives these groups an air of credibility and allows them to project a false appearance of patriotism and duty that belies their true anti-government views and racial, ethnic, and religious hatred. Today, we build on the lessons from that earlier hearing as we seek to understand the veterans' side of the story, specifically why a small but growing number of veterans have been drawn to violent extremism in recent years, and more importantly, what is being done to address this problem. Before going further, I want to be clear on what this hearing is not about. This hearing is not about scoring political points or labeling one party as inherently extremist. While the data is clear, the majority of violent extremist plots and attacks in the United States over the past 3 decades have been committed by far-right actors. Violent extremism does exist on both ends of the ideological spectrum. I hope all of us here today recognize that any viewpoint, when expressed through violence, crosses a dangerous line. Violent conduct is not constitutionally protected speech, and it is outside the limits of the law. Ideologically motivated violence should be rejected by all of us in public office, regardless of party or politics, and it must be a bipartisan concern. We're also not here to condemn or vilify the veteran community. Veterans' beliefs span the political spectrum. The vast majority of veterans continue to serve their country and remain law-abiding citizens long after their military service ends. It is truly a small percentage, a fraction of our nation's 18 million veterans who have engaged in some form of violent extremist activity or who have successfully been recruited by violent extremist groups. However, these numbers are growing, and the consequences of violent extremist activity are serious, not only for our nation, but also for the veterans that may go down a path that leads to violence. Since 2015, 10% of all domestic terrorist plots or attacks have been carried out by military veterans, or more than 15% of those charged in connection with the January 6th attack on our Capitol have military backgrounds. And given that veterans make up less than 6% of the U.S. population, these numbers are particularly alarming. From 1990 through 2021, domestic violent extremist attacks by veterans and active duty service members killed more than 300 people and injured nearly 2,000 more. This includes the 1995 bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, as well as mass shootings at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, outside a Jewish community center in Overland Park, Kansas, and inside a yoga studio in Tallahassee, Florida. According to recent analysis by the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, otherwise known as START, at the University of Maryland, the annual number of violent extremist crimes committed by individuals with military backgrounds has quadrupled since 2010 compared to the previous 2 decades. Let me say that again. The annual number of violent extremist crimes committed by individuals with military backgrounds has quadrupled since 2010 compared to the 2 previous decades. Now, these are facts that we simply cannot ignore. To do so would be a dereliction of our duty as members of Congress and a disservice to the millions of veterans and their families who have honorably served our country. Our objective on this committee, as always, is to advocate for our veterans and to help marshal the resources that are required to appropriately honor their service. And even though today's subject matter may make us uncomfortable, it is a necessary discussion. It is worth asking why a small but growing subset of the veteran community is drawn to violent extremism or is choosing to associate with violent extremist groups. Why are some of the internal factors, what are some of the internal factors like anger, isolation, resentment, or a loss of purpose that are driving even some well-meaning and otherwise honorable veterans down a path toward extremism? What role do external factors such as underemployment, lack of health care access, and online mis- and disinformation play? And finally, what strategies have been found to be most effective in preventing radicalization and in responding to those who have already become radicalized? We must fully understand the physical, psychological, and social factors that make some individuals susceptible to violent ideologies and recruitment by extremist groups before we can effectively formulate and advance solutions to support veterans in need. And so I'm eager to hear from our panelists today and to engage them in a vigorous discussion with our committee members. Domestic violent extremism is a serious and corrosive issue that continues to upend and destroy the lives of veterans and their families. Our committee exists to help veterans in need. Therefore, our mission and our command is clear. We must do all we can to help any veteran that is ensnared in the radicalization process. Today, we will hear about some of the efforts currently out there to help veterans find other pathways to a successful civilian life. And many of those efforts lead us back to veterans and military families themselves who are standing up civil society groups and peer support organizations. By virtue of their own military experience, these groups are often best positioned to regain the trust of veterans and help them find the resources they need to thrive. Veterans deserve our thanks, and they need access to the care and benefits they have earned. But sometimes that road to accessing those benefits can be a bumpy and challenging one. Just as with any other public health concern, we need to collectively acknowledge the problem and look for the best ways to address it. Sometimes the solutions are right in the very communities that we are seeking to help. Ranking Member Boss, thank you for joining me in this effort, and I now recognize you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to welcome our witnesses and the committee members here today. And today's hearing is the second in the last 5 months on violent extremism among our veterans. And I said in the first hearing that I would, and I'll say it again now, free speech must be protected, but violence cannot be tolerated. Violence has no place in our society or politics on either side of the aisle. Given the pace of the committee's hearings on this subject, you might think that veterans often become violent extremists. That's not the case. And it does real harm to the veterans who pretend like it is. It makes it harder for them to succeed as civilians. It makes it harder for them to get jobs. It makes it harder for them to ask for help when they're struggling. That the chairman is furthering such a false and dangerous stigma on that says that the veterans are violent and are a threat to their communities is wrong. And it is especially wrong when it's for nothing but political theater. From the beginning of this so-called investigation, the chairman and his staff have been playing political games and refusing to work in a bipartisan manner. Our first hearing on this was supposed to be last summer. Just a few days before, we found out on Twitter from a reporter that the hearing had been postponed. We later found out that the speaker herself had asked for the postponement. Why? Well, at the time, she was worried that it would interfere with another one of the Democrat majority partisan interests, and that was the January 6th Selection Committee. Last week, the chairman released a staff report on how violent extremism recruit veterans. That release was the very first time that I or my staff had even heard of such a report. We were not given an opportunity to review the report before it was released. We were not given an opportunity to contribute to it. Since then, the majority has refused to even discuss the report or answer our questions about it. The message that sends is pretty clear. The chairman is more interested in advancing his own political interest by painting veterans as radical and violent than he is about moving beyond partisanship to figure out the actual help the veterans who need it. The chairman allegedly called this hearing a, quote, hear the veterans' side of the story, end quote. There are 9 witnesses that we're going to hear from today, and 4 of them are veterans. Of those veterans, Joe Chanley from the AMVETS, who is the witness that I asked for, the chairman also claimed that this hearing is meant to examine the role of peer support in helping veterans. But just one of the 9 witnesses that is at the hearing is a VSO, the obvious source of peer support for veterans. Yet again, that one witness is Joe Chanley from AMVETS, who is the witness that I asked for. If you want to hear the veteran side of the story, Mr. Chairman, why didn't you invite more veterans here today to tell their stories? If you want to learn about peer support for veterans, why didn't you include any of the organizations that Congress specifically chartered to provide it? Something isn't adding up. A few years ago, the New York Times called the VA committee the most bipartisan committee in Congress. That's certainly not the case today. And the ones who are truly harmed by it are the veterans themselves. They deserve better. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I look forward to hearing the witnesses today.
Well, I thank the ranking member. I especially thank the ranking member for his cooperation with selection of witnesses that can further the seeking of the truth with regard to this subject matter. So I want to thank you for that. I do want to push back on some of the things you've made claims in terms of this not being a bipartisan committee, and I still maintain that it is, that the 3 bills that we've brought to the floor this year have garnered pretty strong bipartisan support in spite of the fact that the ranking member in committee did not support those bills. So I would maintain that we've put through product from this committee that has received bipartisan support from the Congress as a whole. With regard to the staff report, the ranking member knows that staff report, well, I don't know if you know, but my staff did engage with your staff to seek participation, and I do want to thank the ranking member for the way in which the first hearing, we did have at that hearing a number of we had witnesses from the VSO community. It was made very clear to us by your staff following our October hearing that this was, quote unquote, our hearing, the majority's hearing, and thus it was up to us to take this issue. I've not heard from you on this topic, either, Ranking Member Boss, and so I find it less than forthright at best to hear complaints now that it's the Democrats who are somehow unwilling to reach across the aisle to combat domestic violent extremism. Just last week, my staff and I have made repeated attempts at the outset of this investigation to work in a bipartisan fashion to address ideologically motivated violence among our veteran populations. I will now call up our first witness panel. First, Mr. John Horgan, a world-renowned expert on terrorist psychology at Georgia State University. Dr. Horgan has spent 2.5 decades studying the radicalization and de-radicalization process and help us understand some of the common pathways into and out of violent extremism. Dr. Pete Siemi is an associate professor of sociology at Chapman University. Dr. Siemi also has a rich background researching anti-government and white supremacist extremists, and he also serves as interim executive director of Life After Hate, a nonprofit organization seeking to interrupt far-right, ideologically motivated violence. Mr. Bill Braniff joins us as an Army veteran, as a co-founder and board member of the nonprofit We the Veterans, and as director of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, or START, at the University of Maryland. And so I just, for the folks out there viewing, whenever we're saying START in the context of this hearing, we're not talking about non-proliferation treaties. We're talking about the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, which is a research unit at the University of Maryland. Ms. Vidya Ramalingam is the founder and CEO of Moonshot, which works to combat online extremism through outreach and community-based support. Ms. Ramalingam previously led the European Union's first intergovernmental initiative on domestic terrorism following the white supremacist murder of 77 people in Norway in 2011. And finally, Mr. Chris Purdy is testifying today as an Army veteran and director of Veterans for American Ideals and Outreach, a coalition of veterans and veteran allies within the nonprofit organization Human Rights First that focuses on encouraging veteran involvement in civil society. We also received a statement for the record from Dr. Ari Kruglansky, a distinguished professor at the University of Maryland. Dr. Kruglansky has performed decades of research on the psychology of violent extremism and co-founded the START Center that Mr. Braniff joins us from. Thank you all for being here, and I will remind our witnesses to pause for 2 or 3 seconds before speaking and answering questions. Dr. Horgan, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost, members of the committee, thank you for your service to our country, to our veterans, and for providing me the opportunity to speak with you here today. My name is John Horgan. I'm a professor of psychology at Georgia State University. I speak here today not as an expert on veterans affairs, but as someone who has studied violent extremism, otherwise known as terrorism, for over 25 years. I believe that research may help us better understand why some veterans become involved in terrorism, and moreover, what we can actually do about it. Now, let me begin by saying something I know everyone here already knows. These are difficult issues to even talk about, let alone research. Irrespective of political affiliation, it is my sincere belief that everyone here today is deeply concerned about veterans. We're not always going to agree on what the solutions look like, or even who ought to have an opinion about those solutions. This is not the only threat facing the country, nor is it the only threat facing veterans. Far from it. Moreover, it shouldn't take concerns about terrorism for us to systematically address the needs of our veterans. But certainly, and if anything, we disrespect veterans by not addressing this problem also. What we know from 4 decades of research on violent extremism is the following. No clear profile has ever been found, not just across the ideological spectrum, but even within specific groups. That is not a failure of research, rather it is the outcome of it. Terrorism today is more diverse than ever before. Men, women, children from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all religions become involved in different ways. And they end up doing different kinds of things within these groups. If anything, diversity is the profile. Now, when it comes to the involvement of some veterans in terrorism, they are often characterized as misguided, troubled, broken people that are manipulated. I know such language often comes from a place of concern about impugning or vilifying our veterans. And while these labels might apply to some, the sweeping use of this characterization is surely offensive to the countless veterans out there who live each day with trauma, but choose not to abandon their oath or subvert our democracy. We know something very, very valuable about who violent extremist groups want. The most proficient terrorist groups will find a role for everybody. But what they want, what they prize above all else, is a recruit who is competent, who will act, who can be counted on to do a job. They want recruits who are resilient, willing to risk everything for a cause bigger than themselves. It might sound very strange, but terrorists want people who have the capacity to care about the plight of others. Perhaps the question that comes from all of this is, why wouldn't terrorist groups go after our veterans? And yet, this is still only half the story. We must ask why some veterans find involvement in these groups rewarding. What needs are these groups fulfilling? In the absence of more research, we can only speculate, but this is a missing part of the puzzle. Now, this puts us in a bit of a bind. We need far more research, yet we don't really have the luxury of waiting around for it to emerge. Until it does, we have several starting points, which I respectfully offer here as suggestions for your consideration. Number one, we must take seriously efforts at early prevention. This will involve such things as better screening at the point of recruitment, ongoing education, and training about the changing nature of terrorism and the risks posed to service members and veterans. Number two, the research tells us that it is peers who are best placed for the early detection of violent extremist activity. But just because they are well positioned, it doesn't necessarily mean they know what to do or where to go to report such concerns. Building on an awareness and educational component, we must develop and put in place clear guidelines for reporting concerns about violent extremism within the ranks. And number three, we must invest in peer support. One of the best ways to help veterans get out of terrorist groups is not just to let them know that they can get out, but to make sure the right kind of peer support is in place to facilitate that. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Braniff. Excuse me, I just lost my place. Who are you calling? Oh, Dr. Horgan. It was Dr. Horgan. Mr. Siemi? Thank you, Dr. Horgan. I'm sorry, it was Dr. Horgan. Dr. Siemi, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairperson Takano, Ranking Member Voss, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. I'm currently a professor of sociology at Chapman University and member of the Executive Committee Leadership Team at the Department of Homeland Security, Office of University Programs of Excellence on Terrorism Prevention and Counterterrorism Research, known as ENSITE. In 1997, I began conducting what social scientists refer to as ethnographic fieldwork with anti-government and white supremacist extremists across the United States and abroad. That fieldwork included, among other things, attending Ku Klux Klan cross burnings, neo-Nazi music shows, racist church services, and living with families in order to learn about their daily lives and how they came to embrace extremism. Our research has also involved conducting intensive life history interviews with more than 100 former extremists. During fieldwork, I encountered extremists who claimed to be either currently enlisted or whose background involved military experience. One of those individuals, Wade Page, whom I met in Orange County, California in early 2000, had previously served in the U.S. Army. Page reported that he had become radicalized after meeting another enlisted member at Fort Bragg who already adhered to neo-Nazi ideology. When Page just discharged from the military in 1998, he began a long descent into the white supremacist movement, including an active role in the international neo-Nazi music scene, which culminated in his August 5th, 2012 terror attack in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, where he massacred 6 individuals attending a Sikh temple. Let me be clear from the outset. The majority of individuals serving in the US military, including currently enlisted and veterans, have no connection to far-right extremism. To be even more clear, serving in the military does not cause a person to become an extremist. Instead, the mechanisms by which military experience may be related to extremism are dynamic and multidimensional. Researchers try to identify some of the specific mechanisms related to how and why extremism and the military overlap in some cases. Studying the issue in this kind of careful way helps prevent overly general characterizations that are neither fair nor accurate. The American people, including those who serve in the US military, deserve a careful assessment of this very serious issue so that prevention and intervention strategies can be as effective as possible. Social scientists sometimes use the term risk factor to refer to adverse environmental conditions that increase the likelihood that a person will experience a variety of negative outcomes, including the onset of criminal behavior. In some cases, risk factors may involve traumatic experiences. Previous social scientific studies demonstrate a large portion of individuals who become involved in far-right extremism typically experience extensive histories of childhood and adolescent trauma. Most individuals who experience trauma, however, do not become involved in violent extremism. Military experience, especially combat, will almost likely certainly involve some types of traumatic experiences that may produce various negative consequences, more generally linked to trauma. In some instances, traumatic experiences, especially complex trauma, results in post-traumatic stress disorder. The point is that individuals with military experience may have been exposed to certain conditions which increase certain vulnerabilities to various negative consequences, such as mental health problems, and in turn may heighten vulnerabilities related to violent extremism. We have also found various circumstances related to leaving the military may generate certain types of vulnerabilities in terms of extremism. In particular, individuals who experience involuntary exits, such as dishonorable discharge, or even cases where a person fails to gain entry to specialized training, can produce an identity crisis of sorts. In turn, extremist recruitment often targets people experiencing these types of crises because they understand how to manipulate and take advantage of individual vulnerabilities. I was also asked to address the work of Life After Hate in terms of what they're doing in the intervention space related to violent extremism. I've been volunteering with Life After Hate since 2017, so we'll restrict my comments to that organization, but want to point out there's various programs doing important work in this area. Life After Hate was founded in 2011 by former white supremacists to help individuals exit the violent far right. By 2022, our organization has grown to serve individuals and families across the United States. The most basic principle that guides Life After Hate's program is the use of an empathetic, non-judgmental approach focused on each client's unique needs. One cornerstone of the model involves the use of a multidisciplinary team that adheres to ethical and legal standards from the respective professions based on empirically supported interventions whenever possible, provided by licensed providers working within their scope of practice. A growing component of Life After Hate services involves supporting family members and friends who know someone they believe is active in the far right, in the violent far right. The same core programmatic components are applied to those cases as well. For individuals swimming in uncertainty and self-doubt, whether the family and friends clients is, or the individual clients trying to leave violent extremism, the process may be a long one with lots of ups and downs and requires that providers like Life After Hate offer patience and stability. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Dr. Siemi. Now we're going to turn to Mr. Braniff for 5 minutes.
Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity. I'm an Army veteran, fortunate to serve as the director of START, a research center that has studied terrorism for over 17 years, and I'm a fired-up board member of We the Veterans, an apolitical and nonprofit veteran service organization committed to building upon the strengths of the veteran and military family community to bolster American civics as a way to crowd out the appeal and the impact of violent extremism and polarizing misinformation. Anti-democratic forces are threatening our American experiment in self-government. We believe veterans and military families are a big part of the solution. But because veterans and military families hold sway in American culture, they're also attractive targets. And even strong communities are not perfectly immune to the siren song of narratives that offer ready answers in an imperfect world. As scholar Kathleen Bilyeu describes in Bring the War Home, at the conclusion of wars throughout U.S. history, small numbers of veterans have played an outsized role in domestic violent extremist movements. Well, we have recently concluded the 2 longest wars in U.S. history, unsatisfactorily, in 2 Muslim-majority countries. And in fact, START data demonstrates that the number of individuals with military service backgrounds engaging in extremist crime over the past decade has more than quadrupled compared to the decade prior. And even if the arrests associated with 6 January are excluded, the number more than doubles. 84% of criminal extremists with military service records were veterans at the time of their criminal mobilization. And 85% of those committed their extremist crime 3 or more years after separation. The average number of years is 15. So while the DoD and the VA have a role to play, neither institution has better access to the veteran community over time than the veteran and military family community itself. It's critical that we establish and resource a veteran and military family-led prevention ecosystem now. 4 characteristics define our approach at We the Veterans. We have adopted a strengths-based and public health approach. We inform our programs with rigorous and ongoing research. We serve to convene and empower multi-sectoral working groups to promote civic culture. We are about civics, not politics. A 2-party democracy that is strong on partisanship but weak on civics is much more easily hijacked by anti-democratic forces. If veteran and military families lead the way on civics, and by doing so hold the line against anti-democratic forces, the country will follow. Let me provide you with a simple, concrete, and unassailable example of our approach. Officials across the nation are raising the alarm regarding a significant shortage of poll workers for the forthcoming midterm elections, in part due to anti-democratic threats and harassment. We the Veterans will partner with other VSOs, MSOs, social media, and other private sector companies and civic organizations to launch Vet the Vote this spring, a drive to mobilize 100,000 veteran and military family poll workers. Having subordinated ourselves to the civilian authorities elected over us while serving, and having sacrificed to promote democracies overseas, veterans and military family members will once again show their support for our elections and our democratic values by filling this critical public service role, reinforcing the public's trust and confidence in our elections along the way. And if this becomes a civic norm for veterans and military families, we'll never again face a shortage of poll workers, and along the way we'll deny anti-democratic forces the opportunity to question the integrity of our free and fair elections. We offer 3 recommendations today. 1, infuse civic education and engagement into military culture during basic intake training, as part of professional military education courses, as a central feature of the Transition Assistance Program, and as a way for veterans and military families to connect with pro-social, veteran, and military service organizations following separation. 2, Congress should encourage the executive branch to partner with We the Veterans and other VSOs and help resource the operating costs of our multi-sectoral working groups, allowing us to convene and empower communities of interest to pilot and evaluate and then scale solutions. 3, ensure the federal government moves beyond punitive measures to identify and disrupt already mobilized violent extremists with military service backgrounds, and invest in veteran and military family-led public health programs, effectively creating a nationwide prevention ecosystem involving civil society organizations, educators, social workers, public health officials, and VA clinicians. At We the Veterans, we're no longer content admiring the problem. We're ready to empower veterans and military families to be the solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Braniff. We will now turn to Ms. Ramalingam for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost, and esteemed members of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Vidya Ramalingam, and throughout my career, I have worked to design and deliver violent extremism prevention models globally. 11 years ago, when a white supremacist terrorist murdered 77 people in Norway, as an American, I led the EU's first intergovernmental initiative on domestic violent extremism. That experience led me to found Moonshot, an organization working with the US Department of Homeland Security and at the state and local levels to build online prevention capabilities fit for the challenges of the 21st century. What used to occur through in-person recruitment and propaganda has shifted to predominantly online radicalization. If we want to prevent violent extremists from exploiting the challenges and the vulnerabilities veterans often face, we have to intervene where extremist groups are seeking to recruit veterans, online. There are considerable learnings we can draw on from the wider prevention field. DHS is assisting states and cities to implement prevention frameworks which leverage a public health approach to violence prevention. There is increasing evidence to suggest that behavioral health methods show promise when applied online. In Moonshot's recent work, Americans consuming extremist content online are 47% more likely than the general public to take up offers of mental health services online. This increases to 115% more likely if they are looking to join a domestic extremist group. In the last year alone, Moonshot has channeled over 150 Americans at risk of violent extremism into text message counseling sessions via online engagement. This is a drop in the bucket given the size of the problem, but it demonstrates progress. There are ongoing efforts by the VA that we can build on to protect veterans. The VA's National Center for PTSD has already been involved in the development of digital apps to help veterans address symptoms of PTSD and mental health needs. These are the kinds of efforts we can build on to reach veterans in online spaces where extremists seek to recruit them. Our recommendations: 1, Congress should direct the VA and DHS to build on pre-existing veteran support services for prevention. Specifically, mental health support, educational and career counseling, family support programs, as well as adjacent fields such as suicide prevention. This will be more sustainable and cost-effective than developing standalone prevention programming for veterans. 2, Congress should increase funding to equip practitioners with tools needed to address the risks of radicalization. Practitioners already providing trauma-informed care for veterans are uniquely positioned to deliver interventions. However, they often feel ill-prepared to engage with individuals who are on the radicalization pathway. These concerns can be mitigated through training that has already been developed and is in use across the country. 3, make these services more accessible to those at risk of radicalization by leveraging online platforms. These services need to be actively signposted in online spaces where extremists are looking to exploit veterans. A recent study by RAND highlighted the potential of online advertising to reach active duty service members for prevention. This model could be used to reach veterans. 4, provide targeted advice for concerned family and friends of vulnerable veterans. It is critical to work alongside veterans' families and civil society, and this includes provision of clear guidance for family and friends who are concerned about loved ones. 5, amplify veterans' voices in the fight against extremism. Veterans can provide a powerful and credible counter-voice against domestic violent extremism. And 6, develop off-ramps for those veterans looking to leave violent extremism. Anyone who is deeply involved in these movements requires more targeted assistance to disengage. It will be more cost-effective to work with pre-existing off-ramps in the United States, for example, Life After Hate, an organization founded by former extremists and supported by DHS. And finally, ensure all prevention mechanisms are adapted for online delivery. This means building the digital literacy and capacity of practitioners across veteran support services involved. We need to proactively reach veterans engaging extremist content online with safer alternatives. The veteran community is, and should continue to be, a resilient and powerful force in the fight against domestic violent extremism. Our veterans have fought to keep our country safe. Now it's our turn to put the support in place to keep them safe from extremists at home. They deserve nothing less. Thank you for your time today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ramalingam. I now want to turn to recognizing Mr. Purdy. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear here today and discuss this urgent threat facing our veteran community and our nation. My name is Chris Purdy, and I'm the Director of Veterans for American Ideals and Outreach of Human Rights First. VFAI is a coalition of veterans and allies who continue their service to America by upholding and defending and advocating for human rights at home and abroad. This generation of veterans, like those who came before us, are bonded by shared experience. We speak a common language, share a worldview, and anchored in public service, and we are committed to building a better world grounded in democratic ideals. We know that veterans are more likely to engage in volunteer efforts, be leaders in their community, and be more bipartisan. In fact, we saw this example last August when veterans from across the political spectrum came together to rescue our Afghan allies in the Kabul evacuation. That moment exemplified the power for good that a united veteran community can have. Unfortunately, that has become an exception rather than the norm. There is a concerted effort to turn veterans against the democratic ideals we swore to defend. This effort is rooted in intentional misinformation campaigns that advance an agenda to set veterans against one another and against elements of society to hinder us from acting collectively for the good of our country. Veterans are targeted because we hold a special and unique place in our society and public life. This generation of service members voluntarily joined a wartime military, knowing the sacrifices we would have to make. We joined knowing that we would likely deploy overseas, but that we had the support of the American public. We believed service to be the highest form of sacrifice, and that our nation saw military service as distinct and honorable. We served at home and abroad under a shared set of values: selfless sacrifice, duty, and personal courage. When we returned home from overseas deployments, veterans maintained that credibility in civilian life. The civilian community extended generous thanks to veterans, and we became credible spokespeople for American ideals. We are grateful for our nation's thanks, and veterans have generally done our best to use this respected social position for good. Others noticed this gratitude and acted to exploit, co-opt, and commodify the veteran community. Commercial brands tried to cash in on veterans' desire to maintain their service-based identities. Social media personalities promoted veterans and the veteran brand to develop large followings. Veteran status became something that could be packaged, marketed, and sold on a t-shirt or in a bag of coffee. Commodifying veteran status is dangerous because it allows people to purchase proximity, and some of those have used it for nefarious purposes. Bad actors recruit veterans to make use of our credibility. Anti-government and white nationalist organizations whose agendas mask themselves in patriotic rhetoric, but are rooted in white supremacy rather than patriotism, have targeted veterans to be the faces and promoters of their movements. Online and off, these groups groom and recruit veterans by exploiting cultural grievances to push veterans towards extremism. First, they encourage our community to be distrustful of our government and our fellow citizens. Then they provide outlets and echo chambers where this distrust builds. Finally, they invite these radicalized veterans into a movement that espouses that same distrust, sometimes violently. As politics has polarized, we have seen politicians use the same strategy of activating veterans to further their aims. Those who would undercut our democracy, oppose racial and religious diversity, and challenge the idea of pluralism are unpatriotic and anti-American. This country's ideals are grounded in the motto E pluribus unum, and history has shown that America is greatest when we celebrate our diversity. Yet these extremists manipulate veterans' voices to further their destructive anti-American aims. While they feign sharing the values of duty and honor and sacrifice, the anti-government militias, extremist organizations, and their supporters are not patriots. It is the responsibility of real patriots to hold these bad actors accountable and hold our leaders to real American ideals. Most veterans recruited in the extremist activity were done so deceptively, and now they must have an opportunity to learn the truth, that reactionary violence is not the way to love and preserve our country. Through community outreach, social connection, and the use of government resources, veterans must work with other veterans to turn them away from violent extremism and back toward democratic action. If we do not, we risk the disintegration of the fabric of American life and the balkanization of our social life. This Congress must respond with solutions. If we do not invest in preventative and restorative policies, we risk generation of veterans continuing to fall prey to violent anti-government actors. To that end, we recommend facilitation and oversight of voter education campaigns to specifically reach veterans, investigation of foreign and domestic disinformation campaigns that target the veteran community, and broad support for community service programs. If we do not take action, those who attempted to violently circumvent the Constitution on January 6th or rallied for white nationalism in Charlottesville in 2017 will continue their destructive anti-American actions. This will result in a generational asymmetric conflict fought between Americans, online and in the streets. And ultimately, we risk further dividing and weakening America, failing in our promise to protect those who protected us. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Purdy. Without objection, the written testimony of our first panel witnesses and statements for the record will be included in the hearing record. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. So I'll begin with Mr. Braniff. Mr. Braniff, you've gathered a lot of data on the prevalence of domestic violent extremism within the veteran community. And it's striking to me that the violent extremist crimes by individuals with military backgrounds has quadrupled since 2010 compared to the 2 previous decades. What does this say to you about the evolving nature of this threat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a numerically small but growing challenge. And it suggests to me that we need to have a prevention ecosystem in place now before those numbers continue to rise. It also, I think, reflects where we are historically. I mentioned in my oral testimony the winding down of the 2 longest wars in U.S. history. There are a lot of grievances that are held among the American population, including the veteran population, about the war in Afghanistan, about the things like vaccines. And what happens is that grievances that may be held legitimately by a portion of the population get manipulated by those who wish to do the country harm. And they seize on those grievances and tie them to broader anti-government narratives, white supremacist narratives, other forms of narrative. And I think that it's really important that we don't diminish the threat posed by those who wish to manipulate veterans and military families. And the reason is that we're not really talking about a numbers game here. Right? It's not about the numbers. This is a national security issue. And it's a national security issue because when veterans are manipulated into anti-democratic or white supremacist movements, they punch well above their weight. It provides an opportunity for hostile foreign influence operators to amplify those anti-democratic actions. It creates vulnerabilities that really undermine our democracy more broadly. And so I really don't think we should focus too much on the numbers, despite being an organization that really focuses on data collection. We really need to focus on the severity of the national security threat that this happens at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hear what you're saying is that even though small number, it looks like a canary in a coal mine. It's an indicator of a much larger looming threat. I'm also interested in your finding that the overwhelming majority of veterans who commit violent extremist crimes commit these acts more than 5 years after their separation from the military. How should this finding inform the approach of traditional VSOs and organizations like We the Veterans in assisting veterans who may not have regular contact with VA?
Thank you. So the solutions lie in the veteran and military family community primarily because, as Dr. Horgan said, they will have access to the population who may be flirting with violent extremist groups or movements. We just need to empower them to know what to do with that circumstance should it arise. It doesn't mean that the DoD has no role to play. It doesn't mean that the VA has no role to play. But an organization like We the Veterans, we see ourselves as connective tissue. If we can empower other VSOs to be in a place to do something about that warning sign and harmonize those civil society actions with the programs being offered through the VA, I think we can really help create that prevention ecosystem. Similarly, if we can use our experience as veterans to inform training and education, that could be used throughout the life cycle of a military serviceman or woman. As I mentioned as my first recommendation, the DoD can help inoculate future veterans against these kinds of manipulation techniques that are used by both extremists and influence operators. So I think we have a role to play as connective tissue, because the problem doesn't sit primarily within the DoD or primarily within the community that the VA is accessing directly. It's out across the country, and therefore we need our VSOs and the veteran and military family community to be in front.
Thank you for that. Dr. Horgan, I'm going to turn to you now. In your decades of research, what are the most common risk factors for violent extremism that you've identified, and are there certain factors that might apply to veterans specifically?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, there are lots of risk factors. I think we know more about what the risk factors are than how specifically they work. One of the common threads across the board, across ideologies, is this notion that a person has more to offer by being involved in terrorism than they do by not being involved. That is a narrative that we ought to be able to push back against, yet without tangible evidence to the contrary, it's a battle that we will always lose.
Well, thank you. I'm going to maybe come back and have you elaborate further and call on on a second round of questioning. I'm now going to call on Ranking Member Boss for his opening comment, for his questions.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Remlingham, what role do you think poor mental health, lack of social support, and lack of economic opportunity play in individuals' vulnerability to violent extremism?
Excuse me. Thank you, Ranking Member. I don't have evidence to suggest that individuals who commit acts of terrorism or who get involved in violent extremism are more likely than the general public to suffer from mental health issues. I don't have that evidence. There may be other witnesses that do. The evidence that I can offer is that in interventions with individuals who have been involved in violent extremism or terrorism, we are far more likely to have engagement with those individuals if we use behavioral health and mental health messages as an entry point to start a conversation with them. So in effective prevention, we know mental health approaches are going to be valuable, and this is why I think it's so important for us to build on the pre-existing practitioner base we have across America of counselors, social workers, to provide interventions with people who are at risk.
So you would probably agree then that increasing access to mental health, peer support, and jobs prevent violent extremism?
Absolutely.
Okay. So to anyone on the panel, let me ask the following questions. I sponsored a bill with Congresswoman Mace that would require a study about cyber risk facing veterans online, including from violent extremist groups. It would also require VA to partner with other agencies and experts to share best practices with veterans about how to stay safe online. Is this something that you as individuals and as groups would also support?
Thank you, Ranking Member. I'm happy to start on this question. I absolutely think that improving digital literacy and improving the skills of the veteran community when they engage on the internet will help in the fight against radicalization. A lot of the battle here is really around the sheer volume of disinformation, information that's seeking to manipulate communities online. And if we can equip the veteran community to be better able to disentangle what they're experiencing online, to distinguish between those that are trying to manipulate them and those that aren't, that will certainly help in solving this problem.
Any others?
Ranking Member, if I may, yes, unquestionably you are correct. I want to sort of reinforce the point that, I think there is an assumption here that all of these services need to be in place for our service members transitioning out. I think that's only part of the issue here. If we're going to take prevention seriously, we must do this at all stages. So we really do need that early intervention component as well to support what you've already suggested.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Ranking Member, one of the 4 working groups of We the Veterans is specifically on misdis malinformation, and we believe, like Vidya, that digital literacy is massively important on this issue. And it really, if you think about it, there are 2 vectors targeting Americans, but also our veteran population. It's recruiters who are looking to manipulate veterans. It's hostile foreign influence operators who are looking to manipulate veterans. They often use wedge issues, emotional argumentation to get people to engage. And so that kind of cyber-based program would ward off both threats, both vectors.
Good. And if no one else wants to answer, Professor Siemi, in your written statement, you discussed that while veteran status may be a risk factor for violent extremism, it can be complicated to make direct connections. This was the case of Jean Craig, who was radicalized decades after her military service. Can you please explain on that and tell us more about why the many factors that can also lead to violent extremism besides just being a veteran?
Thanks for your question, Ranking Member. As Dr. Horgan mentioned in his comments, his opening remarks, we're dealing with a very complicated issue that has a lot of different factors. It's never one thing that generates an outcome like violent extremism or terrorism. It's almost always a combination of factors. And so when you talk about individuals in terms of their radicalization process, you can't point to one thing like experiencing trauma, for example, or like being involved in a particular social institution like the military. It's never going to be one thing that generates this. And so in the case that you mentioned, Ms. Craig, that the lapse in time between her actual involvement in terrorism was substantial, about 15 years. And when she had served in the military, over 15 years, I believe. And a lot of things obviously happened in her life that you would have to account for in terms of trying to explain how she ultimately became involved in violent extremism or terrorism. And as a person, obviously, has various different types of experiences. In some cases, some aspects of those experiences will contribute in varying ways and varying degrees to generate this particular outcome. So I think that's the important point here, is not to be looking for a single factor, but always be thinking about multiple factors and how they kind of work together and combine this unfortunate outcome in terms of violent extremism.
Thank you. And my time has expired, and I look forward to the second round. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. And I'll call on our Health Committee, Subcommittee Chairwoman, Chairwoman Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Siemi, I'm going to start with you and sort of ask a question, I think, kind of where you left off and your answer to the last question. So I think we've been talking a lot about, trying to figure out the determinants that may accrue to violent extremism. And we're mainly focusing in on, it seems to me, unless I've missed something here in everybody's testimony, it seems as though we're focusing more on the transitioning out of the military and what happens out of the military, whether it's isolation, so forth. Now, we can also talk about, and Dr. Siemi, you just mentioned this, about the trauma that happens in the military. There can be a cause and effect here. What I'm trying to zero in on is less about, while albeit important, the transitioning out and what happens after the military, but what's happening in the military, in addition to things like trauma that are happening, to potentially to everyone who is serving. So I guess, is there any research to determine whether some of this radicalization can be happening while members are serving in the military because they are online or they are in close proximity or association or camaraderie with others who are, and this sort of seed gets planted there in the military and carries through leaving the military?
Thanks for your question. In my opening remarks, I mentioned the case of Wade Page, the Sikh Temple shooter in 2012. His life history is a good example of what you're speaking about. His radicalization process, by his own reports at least, started really during his time in the military. and in particular, while meeting another person who was also enlisted at Fort Bragg, as I mentioned, who really kind of introduced him to the ideology of neo-Nazism, introduced him to neo-Nazi music and other literature. And certainly more recently, we've had cases, for instance, with terrorist groups like Atomwaffen, where the founder was serving in the Florida National Guard, and where Atomwaffen, specifically, as well as other groups like the Base and a number of other of these types of terrorist cells, really do target active duty military in addition to veterans as well. And so we definitely do know certain things about some of the strategy and tactics that's happening as it relates to trying to recruit active duty and radicalize these folks. Of course, there's a lot of unanswered questions too, and a lot of information for researcher that's simply not available, which obviously poses certain problems in terms of trying to understand and answer some of these questions more definitively.
Thanks. Mr. Braniff, do you have something to add?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I would direct you to page 29 of the report, Radicalization in the Ranks, that my colleagues at START produced, and which I included as an attachment to my written testimony. We identified 58 subjects who engaged in criminal extremism while serving in the military, about 16% of the overall population of offenders. And we do talk through what the associated risk factors were for that subgroup of the population. You can understand, you can imagine that as being active duty, they're younger, therefore they have fewer of the age-related risk factors that we see among veteran perpetrators, so fewer instances of failed marriages, economic instability. We also see less PTSD associated with those cases. Instead, what we see are more co-radicalization and co-offending with like-minded individuals that they meet in the service. So again, it's a small 16% of the overall population, but the risk factors are markedly different than those of the veteran population.
And do we know if the Department of Defense is really doing anything, creating, pilot programs? We continue to talk about education. Do you know if anything is going on within the military?
Yes, thank you. So the Counter-Extremism Activity Working Group released a report in December where they described some of what they're doing to address this issue. It does include some information on enhancing their counter-insider threat programs. This is their facility to identify individuals who might be engaging in problematic extremist behaviors, not thought, but behaviors. They also talk about, there is an effort to add questions to a periodic survey that the Pentagon puts out across the force to try to determine how frequently servicemen and women are seeing visible indicators of extremist behavior while in uniform, so we can understand over time if that number is going up or down. So they're trying to do a better job of gaining information, gaining data, and then acting on that data through counter-insider threat programs. There's less information available about what the training will ultimately look like, but there is a subgroup that I'll be speaking to next month, actually, about training and how to enhance training regarding this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, I apologize, but I yield my time back.
No, I can understand. It's an interesting topic. General Bergman, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the panel members. To put today's hearing into some sort of perspective and to avoid re-stigmatizing veterans as dangerous, isn't it true that we are talking about a minority of veterans who might find themselves entangled in violent extremism and perpetuating violent actions against their fellow citizens? Again, a minority of a minority. Anybody who would like to offer comment, please do.
Congressman, if I may, yes, you are correct. And yet we have seen throughout the history of terrorism, both at home and abroad, that it often just takes one single person to cause devastation. I don't think this is something we can afford to ignore, despite the fact that it is unquestionably a minority of a minority. I know that previous hearings have spent a significant focus on the numbers, and there have been lots of arguments about the numbers. The unassailable truth about the issue around the numbers is that the numbers are trending in the wrong way. And we have a unique opportunity to make sure that this problem doesn't get even worse to the point where we simply won't be able to do anything about it.
Thank you, sir. And I hate to, cut you short here, but, the one thing that happens is time, once it's gone, it's gone. I appreciate it. And when it comes to prioritizing, not everything can be a number one priority. Our committee works very hard, and our staff works very hard with all the VSOs and all the veterans to understand and prioritize. And think about the fact that how much time, important time, that this committee has spent looking into ways to lower and eventually, hopefully, prevent veteran suicide. There is nothing sadder than a veteran who takes their own life. And when we discuss suicide prevention among veterans, we talk a lot about risk and about protective factors that might either put a veteran at risk of suicide or protect a veteran from considering suicide. What would you say, and again, this is to the whole group, what would you say are the risk and protective factors for veteran involvement in violent extremism? And how can we lessen the risk factors and amplify the protective factors at both the individual and group levels? Because, and just to do a comparison here, isolation leads to higher suicidal ideations. And how do we accomplish balancing that for veterans at risk of being, if you will, potentially consumed or getting involved in violent extremism? Anybody?
Congressman, if I may, so I think one of the things that our research has really shown is that this is about grievance. Extremist actors online will use cultural grievances to target veterans. And when it comes to suicide, and while that is a very important issue, but I don't think that we can. It's not something that we can. It's either or. Either we focus on suicide or we focus on veteran extremism. These things are linked, and we have to address these things as a unit. And what we've seen extremists actually do in the past decade is use wedge issues like veterans versus refugees, or veterans versus immigrants, or veterans versus suicide care as a wedge issue. And it's really important for us to think about this as doing these things collectively, because the other thing that I would just want to say, that this is a very real issue. It's not something that is made up. It is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of people over the past few decades. And if we ignore it at the expense of other things, it's going to have really devastating impacts on our community.
Okay, thank you. And with that, I'll yield back 15 seconds, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, General Bergman. I really appreciate your thoughtful questions. I now turn to Mr. Mervan for 5 minutes.
Dr. Siemi, I understand you have spent a great deal of time interviewing and conducting case studies of far-right extremists, including military veterans who have become involved in violent extreme activities. Can you discuss some of the common themes you've identified in terms of what generally motivates these individuals?
Yeah, thank you for the question. What we're finding in terms of background experiences, some common denominators as it relates to childhood and adolescent traumas of various sorts, very high levels among the former extremists that we've done these intensive life history interviews with, where we really cover all aspects of their life, beginning with their earliest memories to the present. And the level of what they're reporting in terms of these types of traumas and other types of related risk factors far exceeds what you would generally find in the general population, but also even in other high risk samples For instance, samples of individuals who are currently incarcerated or samples of conventional street gang members, which also tend to be high risk populations that even compared to those, we're finding very high levels of reports of things like child abuse in their histories, sexual abuse, parental neglect, family substance abuse in their family histories. So all of these types of issues that we really know produce a lot of different types of negative consequences in many cases, that tend to be linked to a whole host of different types of negative outcomes. We find that in the histories of the former extremists that we've studied in this manner. And so that's, I would say, there's a number of other aspects to it. Those types of trauma, I should say, don't automatically produce someone becoming involved in violent extremism. Most people who experience these types of traumas in their childhood and adolescence don't become violent extremists, but we do find a high prevalence of those experiences among folks that we've studied who did become violent extremists.
And a follow-up question: what role might involuntary exits from the military, such as an honorable discharge or failure to advance one's military career, have on an individual's path toward violent extremism?
Yeah, again, thanks for the question. And just to start with a caveat, again, many people who experience dishonorable discharge or who wash out of special forces training, which has that's not uncommon. Obviously, the vast majority of people who have these kinds of experiences don't become violent extremists. But we do find in cases of folks who do become violent extremists, these are somewhat kind of common denominators of folks with military background. That is that they experience certain kinds of adverse, they have certain kinds of adverse experiences as it relates to leaving the military or not attaining as high a level as they'd hoped to. And that generates kind of a whole downward spiral of sorts in terms of creating kind of an identity crisis, as you might refer to it, where they basically a number of different kind of negative emotions start to build in terms of anger, sense of not being fulfilled. And for those that encounter violent extremists, they kind of fill those gaps for them. They speak to them in ways of that you are valued. You have certain skills, experience that we think are valuable. You may not have felt that way previously, but we're going to fill that gap for you. And so that kind of involuntary exit or lack of attaining certain goals can generate this process. Again, in most cases, people don't go in that direction, but for those who do go in that direction, this can be kind of a theme that you would find in their background.
Thank you. And that lack of mission contributes to that isolation that the general was talking about. Mr. Purdy, I'd like to bring you in on this point as well, because I know it's something you care deeply about. In your view, how might the work of Dr. Siemi and others inform the approaches we take in handling military discharges?
Thank you, Congressman. It is really critical. Involuntary discharges play an inordinate role in the well-being of service members after they leave service. So, if we think about, as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of this relates to grievance. Well, if you have someone who has been involuntary discharged and then they have a need, a mental health need, a physical health need. They need to go back to school. They need housing because they're housing insecure. An involuntary discharge denies those services to our service members at a very critical moment when they are already facing angst and grievance against the government. It really allows an entry point and a gateway for extremist recruiters to come in and say, you know what, the government is really the enemy here. You served your country honorably. You deserve this. They're the enemy. So they are very involuntary discharges are incredibly detrimental to our veteran community.
With that, I yield back.
Well, thank you. Wow, that was very interesting. Mr. Banks, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As many of you know, the VA recently released its asset and infrastructure review recommendations, which include the closure of 86 community-based outpatient clinics nationwide and a reduction of 88 other outpatient clinics. It also includes the closure of 3 inpatient facilities nationwide, including one in my district. This decision may make many veterans feel like they are being abandoned, increasing their desire to seek care or camaraderie elsewhere. Dr. Siemi, what effect does isolation and lack of mental health or inpatient services have on veterans?
Well, I don't know that I'm the best person, to be honest with you, the best person to answer that question, but obviously mental health services are critical importance. Suicide prevention is of critical importance. And, just very quickly, one of the things we do find in addition among the former extremists that we've, studied very closely is that suicide ideation is very common. More than half report either attempting or seriously considering suicide, and mental health issues more generally are also widely reported. So, as it relates to violent extremism specifically, obviously these are important issues, but I think maybe I'd like others to address your question more directly.
Mr. Braniff, any thoughts from your experience?
Thank you, Congressman. In our data set, what we find is that mental health concerns are more prevalent among veterans who go on to engage in extremist crime than other extremists who go on to engage in extremist crime. So it appears to be a particularly important risk factor among the veteran community. It's not the only, but it is a significant one compared even to other extremists who engage in extremist crime.
But can you, Mr. Braniff, can you unpack those feelings of isolation that veterans feels? How can that be affected by closing VA facilities that provide mental health care? Does it make them feel more isolated?
I can't speak to the individual experience. That's not something we've looked at in our research, but it's commonsensical that if someone has a more difficult time accessing services, then they may feel more isolated, more alone, and may seek other sources of comfort, as you've suggested. That seems to make sense to me. One of the questions is whether or not that VA facility is the place that veterans are going to turn to first. Certainly, it's important. It's an incredibly important asset. We think there might be other peer-related opportunities to bring people in first and then direct them into professional services. And so we do think there's a role for the community as well as the professionals. Thank you.
So if the VA does end up closing inpatient centers, what steps, to any of you, what steps do community providers need to take to effectively fill that void and ensure that veterans have access to mental health treatment? We'll start with you, Mr. Braniff.
It would be very important for those community service providers to understand the veteran experience and to be able to relate to those individuals, which may not be easy for many who are outside of that military community.
Ma'am?
Congressman, if I may, and thank you for your questions, I would really urge both the VA and working closely with VSOs to consider how better to digitize services, especially for closing those in-person centers. I mean, we've discussed already the role of the internet in reaching out to individuals who are at risk. Moonshot, actually last year, in 2020, November 2020, we were looking at conspiracy theory communities online, domestic violent extremist communities online. We tracked a 66% increase in references of suicide in conspiracy theories online. So the discussions we're having around the prevalence of suicide within the veteran community are even more augmented in a context where people are engaging with this sort of content online. We need to be offering these services in those spaces so we can get people care where they're looking for this sort of content.
What's your advice to community care providers, those outside of the VA to get there, who don't understand the sophistication of what you're talking about?
This is where I would urge Congress to be pushing the VA and also the Department of Homeland Security to be working with those community service providers to help them digitize their services. This is not something that they can necessarily do themselves without the funding and without the support to do so. Okay,
thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I want the gentleman from Indiana to understand that I share his concerns about the Air Commission recommendations, and that I remind the gentleman that they're based on market assessments that were done by the previous administration, and that I have some questions about the data. We will be doing oversight So I want the gentleman to know that you'll have an opportunity to participate in that oversight, and that we share a concern about this. I also share Ranking Member Bost's interests in increasing the overall access to mental health care and to making sure our veterans are served. But we have an opportunity, but there are also, I want to make sure that this process, I did not fully support the provision in the Mission Act, although I voted for the Mission Act. I was very concerned about the Air Commission. There are members on both sides of the aisle that are concerned about these initial recommendations. They're not decisions. The recommendations that are based on the Air Commission, and the Air Commission based on the assessments, the market assessments. So I want that to get out clear. There are many news outlets that carried these recommendations as decisions. So to the people of Indiana and the people of your district, Mr. Banks, I want to reiterate that these were recommendations based on market assessments. These market assessments are far from flawless. There's some real issues. Number one being, I don't think they reflected the lessons we've learned on how private sector and VA has delivered. They've changed the way they're delivering care. So market assessments don't reflect that. So this is a bipartisan concern. And Ranking Member Boss, this will be a bipartisan. We are bipartisan, and we're gonna look at this. Go ahead, Mr. Ranking Member Boss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. We do want to know, and everyone needs to know, because this is kind of rolling through Congress and the veterans community on this particular issue. These are recommendations. The Air Commission themselves have not been approved by the Senate. They finally did get I know there was a drag on the Republican side in the Senate to get all of the nominees there. Those are there now. They have to be approved. Then this process is a very, very long process. We expect it to be as much as 3 years for the Air Commission to work through and have hearings out in the public. And there's a lot of information that is out there, but understand that this is just the recommendations of the VA. It is not law yet.
Yeah, and I appreciate the gentleman's concern. And I hope the gentleman understands that his concerns are shared by a wide number of members on both sides of the aisle. I now call on Representative Representative Sherfilis McCormick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Chris Purdy. Mr. Purdy, like Chairman Takano, I'd also like to drill down just a little bit on the number of veterans engaged with domestic violence extremist groups like Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, 3 Percenters, and other far-right militias. Do you have any estimate of veteran membership for some of these groups? And if so, how are we able to collect this data?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. Last year, Veterans for American Ideals conducted a research into the Oath Keepers through open source data of about 25,000 names of Oath Keepers that were provided to us. We were able to identify about 65% of those individuals either were in the active duty military community or were part of the veteran community. This represents a serious threat. And so I just really want to say, when we talk about the minority of veterans being extremists is absolutely correct, but they are by no means the minority of those who are being in the Oath Keepers, for example. So these are folks that have been recruited over time. They span the geographic divide, and they also span the divide of enlisted to officer. Everyone from the lowest E5 up to we were able to identify an 06 on the high end. So there's quite a breadth here.
For those that argue that the veteran extremism is not a widespread issue or that we do not have an adequate amount of data to explain its significance, how do you respond? And someone with extensive experience studying this topic and as an Army veteran yourself.
Thanks. Well, I myself witnessed extremist activities while I was in the military. So that's my own anecdotal experience. What I will say is that the current military structure is doing everything that it can from our perspective to conduct security stand downs, of extremism in the ranks. But really, more needs to be done. There needs to be more research on this, more research from this committee, more research from DoD, so that we could see really how far that this goes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Purdy. My next question is for Ms. Ramagrama. Sorry for the mispronunciation. Moonshot has also conducted extensive analysis on the sheer amount of violent extremist content online and how social media or other digital platforms can be a fertile breeding grounds for violent individuals who are plotting or recruiting others to carry out violent attacks. You may not have specific numbers on veteran participation, but what can you say about the trend lines for violent anti-government or white supremacist content online in recent years?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Domestic violent extremist groups thrive in moments of crisis. That's undeniable. Especially the white supremacist ideology is premised on the notion that a race war is coming. Now, crises are moments where we see them grasping onto fear and anxiety in order to grow. And in the last 2 years, America has experienced multiple crises, concurrent crises, overlapping and on top of one another. In the online space, so in particular, we've seen the COVID-19 pandemic. All of us are spending more time online. In addition, extremists are spending more time online. We tracked, going back to April 2020 at the start of the pandemic, a 37% increase in attempts to access domestic violent extremist content on search engines across the country. As of a year later, April 2021, that number had gone up to 140% higher levels of engagement with white supremacist content on search engines. So we are generally in a heightened moment of engagement with extremist content online. That's undeniable. These groups also latch on to current affairs, and Ukraine is perhaps the thing that's in the back of all of our minds right now. When the invasion of Ukraine began, we saw domestic extremists starting to mobilize online. We saw militant white supremacists encouraging others online who espouse their ideologies to travel to Ukraine. And to be very clear, there are veterans who are traveling to fight in Ukraine for legitimate reasons. The worry that I have is extremists encouraging those with their ideology to go to Ukraine to gain battlefield experience, and then be able to use those skills upon their return. So these are just some of the trends we're seeing develop online and the ways in which those groups are specifically targeting veterans.
I want to get this question in real quick. What do you see as the role of civil society groups or tech sector itself to addressing this problem? And can we rely on the content moderation alone to remove dangerous posts and messages from advocating violence?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The tech companies are scrambling to meet really ambitious targets to remove that content from the internet. That said, we need to accept if we're going to actually effectively deal with this problem online, we need to accept two things. One, there will always be content that falls in the gray zone, and especially as a country that needs to protect its First Amendment right, there will always be content that just needs to stay online. But second, there will always be some spaces on the tech platforms that are just not liable for moderation, where we can't actually remove the content. And actually, Google search is the greatest example here. You can enter anything you'd like into Google search. It doesn't stop you, right? And so in order to effectively deal with the spread of this content on the internet, our solution can't just be about moderation. We have to be using these platforms to reach out to people at risk and offer them safer alternatives. So this is fundamentally about both protecting our First Amendment right and ensuring there's more safer content available to people at risk online.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Sir Phyllis McCormick. Mr. Nels, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Nels, can you hear me? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I'll move to Ms. Miller-Meeks. Ms. Miller-Meeks, 5 minutes. ISIS, can you turn on your mic, Ms. Miller-Meeks? Is it on? Do we need to move to another? Why don't we move you to a different station? It's still not working, Dr. Miller-Meeks. Why don't we try and get you a mic that works?
Does this one work?
It does work. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much, and thank
I
you.
apologize for that, Madam.
Not your fault, sir. It's bureaucracies. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just going to start by saying that my maternal grandfather was in World War II, died at a very young age when my mother was 2 from both seen and unseen scars of World War II. My maternal uncle's ship went down in the Pacific, and he then spent the entirety of his life in his very early 20s at a VA institution prior to his death, never having been with his family. My father served in the Air Force. 6 of my siblings served in the military as well. I'm a 24-year military veteran, and my husband is a 30-year military veteran, both of which we have done deployments and humanitarian efforts, both here in the U.S. and abroad. We mentioned that you don't have good data on percentage of vets that are either in groups on the left, such as Antifa or Occupy Wall Street, or groups on the right. So I'm just going to ask a very simple question of you. Is it 50% of veterans who are involved in groups that you would consider to be domestic terrorism? Is it 40%? Is it 30%? Is it 20%? Is it 10%? 1%? Less than 1%? So I'm going to tell you as a military veteran that this is the second hearing we've had in 5 months on this topic, and I find it offensive that we are characterizing veterans as domestic terrorists, and I've seen that in communications all the way back to Janet Reno. And we have not had one hearing on the impact on the mental health of our veterans after the inept, incompetent, and disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And as a Vietnam-era veteran and having a brother who had served in Vietnam, I can tell you that for those veterans that are Vietnam veterans, for those Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, this issue is personal, and it was deja vu, that they would be betrayed by their government and did not have their backs. Their mental health issues, their PTSD skyrocketed. I've visited with them. And because of how this debacle has unfolded and this hyper-focus on veterans as domestic terrorists by the VA committee, by veteran advocacy groups, and veteran institutions, and granted, it is an important topic, and we absolutely need to address it, but it has caused mistrust in our veterans. I have veterans approach me whenever I'm at home in Iowa, which is as often as I can be, that they do not trust going to the VA or calling the VA crisis hotline to address or get mental health services. And that's a travesty. And I've heard it repeatedly, not just from one veteran. So in Iowa, we're actually recruiting veterans to our state. We have a home-based Iowa initiative started by Ambassador Branstad, then Governor Branstad. We eliminated the income tax on veterans' pensions. Why? Because veterans show up on time to work, they train, they're dedicated, they're intelligent, they're hardworking, they improvise and adapt, and they focus on problem solving. And they have leadership skills even when they don't realize that they're exhibiting those leadership skills. It's why I sponsored the Vet Tech program, and it's why we have looked at bills such as the GI Bill need and VRE in order to give extension when their GI Bill benefits work out. So my question is, can you describe how the importance of employment helps to adjust our veterans with mental health issues, and why we have a lack of peer-oriented programs, which certainly outside of the VA system are beneficial in helping with mental health and behavioral health needs? Thank you.
So none of us are here representing the VA, but as a board member of a veteran service organization, we agree that we need to recruit the next veteran. We need to proactively recruit the next veteran for all the reasons that you've described. They're incredible human beings who have demonstrated that they can overcome adversity, that they're mission-oriented and patriotic. And the question is, what are we competing for them to do? What we're competing for them to do at my organization is engage in building American civic culture, the foundational ideas that support our democracy. And we think that there's lots of very positive ways to channel all of that energy. In terms of your question about employment, we do see that among veterans who engage in criminal extremism, that job insecurity and unemployment is one of the risk factors that manifests over 10, 15 years and may be associated or is correlated with criminal extremism behaviors. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Braniff. And thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentle lady. I just want to remind the gentle lady that in September of last year, we did hold a hearing, the full committee hearing on mental health and the concerns following the withdrawal from Afghanistan and its effect on our veterans. And as a result, we have negotiated with the four corners the Strong Act. But what's holding us back from moving forward with the Strong Act are the minority's concerns about the discretionary costs. I do want to now call on Ms. Underwood for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the committee's last hearing on the topic of domestic violent extremism in October, I was shocked by the hesitancy of so many people participating in the hearing to name the threats that we're facing. Our witnesses have laid out the evidence showing that specific groups like the Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, and 3%ers have targeted veterans in their recruitment efforts. And while it is important to note that the vast majority of current and former service members are not associated with these groups, research shows that there has been an upward trend in recent cases of criminal extremists with military backgrounds. To effectively prevent domestic violent extremism among veterans, we need to follow the evidence and be explicit about what's happening. Our veterans deserve this respect. The added risks they face from domestic violent extremist groups are because of their service to our country. This means naming the domestic violent extremist groups that are targeting veterans, just as we name foreign terrorist organizations that pose a threat to the security of the United States, or foreign adversaries that target service members for information. Mr. Braniff, can you explain the importance of being explicit in identifying the specific domestic violent extremist groups that target veterans and the consequences of failing to do so?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. In our data, we do our best to identify any group affiliations associated with those who engage in extremist crime, as well as general ideological categories. We think it's really important if you're going to try to engage in training, professional military education within the ranks, we need to understand what are the most likely observable indicators of violent extremism that one might see and therefore be able to react to. And those indicators are different across the different ideological milieus and the different organizations.
Mr. Braniff, that was not my question. My question was about naming the explicit groups. Do you have a point of view on that?
Yes, that it's valuable to do so so that you can better educate and train individuals to recognize threats, and we do so in our data. If you're asking about a federal designation of domestic terrorist organizations, that is not something I would support. Thank you.
Yep, that was not my question. Mr. Braniff, in your testimony, you underscore the important role of VSOs in preventing violent extremism among veterans. What recommendations would you offer to VSOs and other stakeholders about how they can identify, name, and proactively communicate with veterans about specific domestic violent extremist groups that target former service members?
We think it's very important to provide what are called community awareness briefs about the current state of the threat in the United States based on empirical data and not political whim or opinion. And so we think it's really important to provide as factually accurate information as possible while also not just focusing on the current moment, but talking about the techniques that all extremist groups use to manipulate people so that a serviceman or woman could identify, or a veteran could recognize those manipulative tactics when they're used by whomever is using them. Thank you.
And that is something that you coach VSOs to proactively communicate?
Yes, it's one of the goals of We the Veterans is to engage with VSOs to build their capability to serve as a preventative ecosystem, and that requires awareness.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Braniff. In addition to the veteran service organizations, VA also has a critical role on these issues. Ms. Ramalingam, your organization receives funding from the Departments of Homeland Security and the Department of State to address violent extremism. To what extent is VA currently coordinating with federal agencies that actively track domestic violent extremism, and what opportunities exist for deeper collaboration between the VA and DHS, the FBI, and other relevant agencies to prevent violent extremism among veterans?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I can't speak to the level of coordination ongoing right now between the VA and DHS, but what I can say is in order to protect veterans that are being targeted by extremists, we do need to build on pre-existing services, and who best to offer those services, who's already offering those services to the veteran community than the VA. We would hope that DHS and that the VA can work together to ensure that existing mental health support, career counseling, community outreach, all of the services we've talked about today are better equipped to be able to handle individuals who present at those services and start to show those signs and signals of radicalization. These efforts shouldn't necessarily be run out of Washington. We believe they should be coordinated at the level of the VA's regional veteran integrated service networks. This should be a local initiative from the ground up. But in addition, as I've mentioned earlier, the VA has a role to play in digitizing services to ensure better access specifically to veterans who are in online communities where they are being targeted by extremists.
Thank you so much to our witnesses. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Underwood. And I'll call on Mr. Gallego for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start today by thanking the witnesses for being here and Chair Takano for holding this important hearing. Talking about domestic violent extremism is always difficult, but it is especially hard to talk about it when it comes to the veteran community. I was on the House floor on January 6th when the Capitol was attacked by domestic violent extremists, aka insurrectionists. On January 6th, it was my Marine training that kicked in and allowed me to help the other members stranded on the floor to put on their gas masks, keep calm, and unfortunately even prepare to fight. Other veteran members of Congress also helped members stay calm up in the galleries as rioters were banging on the doors. Many of the Capitol police officers who defended this building that day are veterans as well. On January 6th, I was grateful that they were veterans in the Capitol to fight for our colleagues and to defend democracy. Because as any veteran knows, serving your country doesn't end when you leave the service. Our veteran community represents the best of America, which is why I was horrified and angry when I found out how many veterans had been among the insurrections that day. I felt betrayed, because those veterans have forsaken the same oath we all took to protect and defend this country and democracy. I want to be clear. The more than 70 veterans charged in the attack on January 6th represent a small fraction of our veteran community, a very small fraction. But veterans were overrepresented among those insurrectionists. And we've now seen evidence that groups like Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, and the Proud Boys are specifically targeting veterans. That's why it's so important that we address this issue head-on, like we are today, and that's why I'm grateful for our witnesses' insights. My first question is for Mr. Braniff. If I'm not mistaken, you attended the United States Military Academy and served 5 years as an Army officer and company commander. Following your service, you joined the faculty at West Point. My question for you is, as a veteran and someone who has devoted your entire professional career to studying terrorism and counterterrorism, what is your reaction when you hear someone say that it's ridiculous to suggest that we need to address extremism in the military or veteran community, or that holding this hearing is somehow an insult to the 20 million veterans who have honorably served our country and are not involved with violent extremism? Do you think we are doing a disservice to people like you and me by having this discussion?
Thank you, Congressman. 21 years ago, I sat on a hilltop in Kosovo with my tank platoon. That platoon was comprised of several African Americans from around the United States, Jamaican, Haitian, a Dominican, a Jewish American, 2 Filipinos, a Micronesian, and a shade tree mechanic from Alabama. It would be a dishonor to my tank platoon to say that things like white supremacy in the ranks is too small an issue for us to care about. We're a brotherhood and a sisterhood, and the idea that it would be okay for an organization that has grooming standards about your haircut, height and weight standards, shouldn't have standards about violent extremism in the ranks. It's not a numbers issue, it's a national security issue. We have an all-volunteer military. Who is going to join an all-volunteer military if that all-volunteer military is associated with extremism? That's a national security issue. It creates vulnerabilities to hostile foreign influence operations. It decreases our combat effectiveness. It undermines the preface of civilian control of the military. If our military members are putting ideology or party in front of country, it makes it easier for our servicemen and women to be manipulated, and it undermines our combat effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you. Lastly, Mr. Purdy, I want to ask you for your reaction to the fact that so many of these far-right extremist groups use the word patriot in their title. For example, United Constitutional Patriots or the White Patriot Party. I think it's a perversion of the word patriotism and of the oath you and I took. Why do you think these groups use that term so often, and how can we push back on it?
Well, I mean, they use it because of the credibility that it holds. They are essentially stealing our honor, cashing in on our valor of service to advance their anti-American and white nationalist aims. And I share Mr. Braniff's disdain for this as well. So, I mean, it's very simple. Veterans are economically efficient targets, and the word patriot exudes an aura of veteran status.
Thank you. And Mr. Braniff, one question. Representative Miller Meeks said that Representative Reno was talking about veterans being domestic terrorists all the way back during the Clinton administration. Would you imagine why she would be, Attorney General Reno would be talking about that, specifically around that time?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I believe there was a report regarding the concern over veterans joining domestic violent extremist groups, and it created a political backlash. The unit at the Department of Homeland Security responsible for that was basically shuttered, and unfortunately, some of the concerns that were raised proved to be accurate.
Correct, because it proved to be accurate because Timothy McVeigh, a veteran, violent extremism, eventually went and bombed the Oklahoma City Federal Building, correct?
That is correct. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gallego. Well, you know, with some reluctance, I'm going to call to an end the first panel. You are all amazing scholars and amazing researchers and have a wealth of information. And I'm going to remember your names because I think you have the potential to give us insight not just on extremism as a phenomenon among a really small subset of veterans, but I think you have insights into how radicalization may take hold more generally. And so I think you have some important lessons to teach the nation and the world about how we begin to address extremism as a phenomenon. But I thank you for the insights you've given us today in terms of how it shows up in certain veterans. So that completes the questioning of this panel, and I want to thank our witnesses for appearing today. And we'll now move on to our second panel. I'm going to give the second panel just a few moments to get situated. I would be remiss if I didn't also really thank the members of the minority who participated in the first panel. I thought the questions were very good questions, and I appreciate the spirit with which they engaged a very difficult topic. So I now call up and recognize our second panel. First, Mr. Chris Buckley joins us as a U.S. Army veteran and a white supremacy specialist at Parents for Peace, a nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting families concerned about a loved one who has fallen prey or is at risk of falling prey to domestic violent extremism. Ms. Emma Juan also represents Parents for Peace, where she worked to establish and build the organization's intervention helpline and trauma recovery program. Mr. Joe Chanelli is a U.S. Marine Corps veteran and a National Executive Director of American Veterans otherwise known as AMVETS, the nation's fourth largest veteran service organization. Mr. Shinelli was honorably discharged from the military in 2006 after serving in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Kuwait, East Timor, and the Horn of Africa. Ms. Sarah Strader, Executive Director of the Secure Families Initiative, a nonprofit organization that advocates on behalf of military spouses and families. I'm pleased to note that Ms. Strader was also recently selected as an AFI 2022 Military Spouse of the Year. I want to thank all the panelists for being here, and I want to remind our witnesses to pause 2 or 3 seconds before speaking and answering questions. Mr. Buckley, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost, honorable members of this committee, it's an honor and a privilege to testify here, even though I'll be sharing some difficult things from my life. My name is Chris Buckley, and I served as an E5 Sergeant in the 201st Engineer Battalion of Kentucky Army National Guard. I joined the Army as part of the delayed entry program while still in high school. I remember how proud I was to have the honor to be on the front lines of defending my country, as that Tuesday morning I saw on TV, my high school cafeteria, the collapse of the Twin Towers. But the way I saw my country rally around its suffering made me proud to be an American soldier. You could call me an idealist. How did I go from that to becoming a Ku Klux Klan member? It's a strange tale, but one that I sadly, not uncommon amongst our veterans. I was not born racist. In 2008, when I was deployed to Afghanistan, I made friends with a generous and kind local Afghan named Abdullah. In the afternoons, we sipped tea together and exchanged stories of our lives before the war. I could see how we were not so different. Abdullah was later caught sneaking an improvised explosive device into our bunker. Abdullah, my friend, wanted to kill me and my buddies just because I was an American. There were a lot of days like that in Afghanistan, but none shook me as much as losing my best friend a few months later. His name was Daniel W. Wallace, father of 2 of Dry Ridge, Kentucky. On October 31st, 2008, somewhere in eastern Afghanistan, we were chatting and had just left our vehicle to fix a piece of equipment when we were ambushed by Taliban. I saw Daniel get hit by a bullet under his left eye and his skull get shattered by the impact of the bullet. Daniel died in my arms while trying to push his brain back into his skull. I came back from Afghanistan a different man. I had developed a deep sense of resentment against all Muslims. In fact, I tattooed the word kafir, or infidel, in Arabic script on my arm as a way to remember who my enemies were, who had taken my best friend away. My psychological damage in Afghanistan was accompanied by a crippling physical injury in the U.S. I severely injured my back. Although I received workers' compensation, I was never given a line of duty determination, even though to this day I cannot put socks on without grimacing in pain. Following the accident, I was put on opioids, which I quickly became addicted to, just as I was developing a habit of numbing my psychological pain by resentment directed against my growing list of enemies. You see, my trauma opened other wounds that had never really healed, and I had simply repressed, like that time when I was sexually molested by a family member, or that other time when I was discharged from the Army and received no compensation for PTSD from the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. Instead, there was a loving group eager to embrace me and acknowledge my pain. It was the Ku Klux Klan, and they did not approach me with pitchforks or burning crosses, but with a plate of barbecue ribs, a Bible, and the promise of brotherhood I missed from my days in the Army. In fact, I probably still would be in the KKK had it not been for the intervention of my wife. My 4-year-old son had started asking for his own KKK outfit. My wife had just had enough. She gave me an ultimatum. It was going to be either her and my son or the Ku Klux Klan or drugs. In the meanwhile, she reached out to a former extremist online who took me in touch with Parents for Peace. In order to take back my life, I had to quit my drug addiction. I had a few relapses, all of them on Halloween, the day I lost my friend in that ambush. Giving up my addiction to hatred and resentment was not any less challenging. I wanted to blame others. I wanted to remain an angry victim rather than take responsibility for my own actions. And I wanted a quick fix to numb my pains right then and there. Prevention of radicalization is always better than treatment. We need to prepare our troops not only for being soldiers, but also for civilian life when they transition home. We need preventative solutions to our soldiers to deal with the trauma of active duty in healthier ways. I'm very proud to have contributed to one such solution at the Trauma and Recovery Program. I'll be delighted to work with you, the members of the Department of Veterans Affairs, and anybody else to see how we can expand on this initial resource into program for veterans. As part of working on myself, I pledged that for every person I recruited into the Ku Klux Klan, I wanted to pull 10 others out of extremism. While I am ashamed of my time in the Ku Klux Klan, I am proud to be on the front lines of combating this threat and becoming an interventionist at Parents for Peace. I'm helping on extremism cases from KKK to Islamism, eco-terrorism, Antifa, and others. Extremism is not a political problem, but a public health issue. This is not simply a Republican or a Democrat problem. This is not a black problem or a white problem, a Muslim or a Christian problem. This is a human problem. By politicizing the issue, by confronting extremism to only one group of people, by using it as yet another weapon against the opposite side of the aisle and our political rivals, we don't heal the wounds, we just inflame them. Perhaps my story could tell you something about what happens when we as a society make a habit of resorting to quick and easy fixes that leave all of us worse off. Perhaps my story could be warming for what's at stake for when we get too comfortable with our status as victims and each other's actions. We prefer to assign blame rather than take responsibility, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here to tell you that bad things happen, but it's up to us to choose what we do with our wounds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley. I want to return to Ms. Juan. Ms. Juan, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chair Takano, Ranking Member Bast, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I appreciate your leadership to foster better cooperation on ensuring the well-being of the veterans community. My name is Imaj Wen, and I'm the Director of Programs and Research at Parents for Peace. And I'm honored to speak to you today about our organization and our work to support the veterans community. To understand the purpose of Parents for Peace, one must know its origin. On June 1st, 2009, Carlos Bledsoe committed a terror attack in Little Rock, Arkansas. Years before, Carlos was groomed on campus by teachers and clerics and had traveled to Yemen to train with a Salafi group. After being arrested by the Yemeni police, Carlos was deported back to the United States. Soon after, he carried out his attack. After Carlos's arrest, his father, Melvin Bledsoe, an African-American business owner from Memphis, decided to break his silence and talk about what happened to his family. Opening up, he realized that he wasn't alone and could, through his misery, bring together other parents of extremists and survivors. From there, he created Parents for Peace, a support network from families who had been devastated by the grooming of their loved ones into extremism. Since then, the organization has evolved. Today, Parents for Peace is an organization aiming to provide a public health solution to domestic radicalization in the United States. For the last decades, most counter-violent extremism approaches have taken a law enforcement or criminal justice approach, falling short of successes. We came to fill this gap. Through hundreds of interviews with families of extremists, formers, and individuals still grappling with extremism, we were able to recognize patterns of radicalization. One correlating factor found is a major disruption to one's sense of self, the appearance of such strong self-doubt, leading to a desperate need for clarity, belonging, or purpose. Mixed with pre-existing vulnerabilities, it renders certain individuals at a higher risk of exposure to violent extremist ideologies. These vulnerabilities can wear different masks, can be unhealed trauma, such as childhood sexual abuse, bullying, a history of addiction, alcohol, drugs, gambling, or mental and neurological disorders, depression, or forms of learning disabilities. When unaddressed, these vulnerabilities create shame, guilt, or pain, so buried they become unrecognizable. To be able to bear the burden of their suffering, individuals use alternative pathways to channel anger and resentment. Extremism provides a superficially appealing solution by offering an opportunity for numbing and a sense of belonging. I stand here in front of you not to stigmatize and point fingers, but to shine a light on their reality. Because of their life experiences, some people are more vulnerable to radicalization. Some veterans are part of this vulnerable population. Men and women who have served in the military have a higher prevalence of adverse childhood events. Additionally, through a necessary process, service members are trained in order to effectively complete missions of combat. While undergoing training, service members integrate complex mental, emotional, and visual tactics, which allows them to perform effectively under high stress and high tempo situations. Unfortunately, hypervigilance remains even after returning home from combat, and the psychological impact of sustained exposure to trauma and violence leaves a lasting mark. According to data collected in 2021, about 75% of US veteran and active service survey respondents stated they had experienced PTSD as a result of their military service after 9/11. To address this issue, we founded and designed the Trauma and Recovery Program. Its aim is to provide service members with positive coping skills, tools, and resources to maintain a balanced, healthy, mental, emotional, and physical lifestyle, while reducing the number of service members participating and or being groomed into ideologies of extremism. The program was successfully piloted back in March 2021 amongst law enforcement officers at the RR Police Department. This is what we do. We analyze and identify an issue and provide solutions to limit stigmatization. Additionally, for the last 5 years, Parents for Peace Helpline, available at 1-844-49-PEACE, has helped hundreds of people exit extremism with a unique intervention protocol developed in conjunction with global experts. Family members, friends, and loved ones call our helpline to seek assistance about someone close to them who has shown traits of radicalization. Our in-house clinicians conduct interventions to help through the de-radicalization and rehabilitation process. Our intervention effort is about de-escalating the individual from the shortcut path back to a place where the core issues driving the initial turn to extremism can be addressed. Every day, we work tirelessly to provide services to individuals who have fallen ill to extremism. Ignoring widespread risk factors would be detrimental to the safety and prosperity of the United States. We need to create alleys of cooperation between organizations providing support to veterans and organizations specializing in addressing the prevention of extremist violence. Investing in such educational resources and programs will allow the risk to be reduced. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Juan. I now will call on Mr. Schinelli for 5 minutes. Mr. Schinelli.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost, members of this committee. As the largest veterans service organization that represents all of Americans' veterans, AMVETS is honored to share our thoughts and expertise as it relates to the complex and multifaceted events that led us to the point of having a congressional hearing that uses the words veteran and violent extremism in the same sentence. First and foremost, AMVETS must highlight one critical fact. The vast majority of military veterans are productive, law-abiding, nonviolent members of society. Each of us here today have the responsibility to help dispel the manufactured misconception of extremists prone to acting out violently. Throughout our nation's history, American veterans have continued serving and leading long after hanging up their military uniforms for the last time. Most of our nation's presidents were veterans. At one point, 3/4 of the U.S. House of Representatives were veterans. Our nation's veterans are proudly diverse, inclusive, representative of general society. Coming from all walks of life, we are unique in that we chose to put our nation before ourselves, but we are affected the same as anyone else by misinformation, propaganda, and an increasingly corrosive political environment in which politicians spend more than $8 billion per election cycle to tear one another apart. In my written testimony, we discuss how and why veterans tend to be overrepresented in civics, how the American political industry plays a role in not just the extremism among Americans, but extremism in America. I discuss how veterans present more of a solution to extremism versus being part of the problem, and how Congress has spent billions of dollars on poor performing mental health programs at VA that are generally ineffective for far too many. The bottom line is that we all have to play a role to maintain a respectable, influential nation, a nation that does not tolerate extremism from Democrats, Republicans, or anyone else. As the issue of extremism relates to veterans, we indeed need to do more to help as service members transition into veteran status, so they're even more likely to become positive contributing civilians. Poor mental health can leave anyone vulnerable to those recruiting for extremist causes, veteran or not. This is another reason Congress needs to become more serious about improving and innovating VA's mental health care system. We need to provide effective mental health care options and directly assist nonprofits providing meaningful peer support. We could ask these nonprofits to provide veterans with important information about extremist groups, recruiting tactics, and why they are harmful to veterans. It's important to note that historically, VA has not meaningfully supported peer support type programs. In general, Congress and VA have chosen not to meet veterans where they are and have resisted efforts to work with community organizations in a meaningful way. This year, we will spend nearly $14 billion on a mental health system for veterans who really are not offered assistance until they reach their worst days. After 2 decades of more of the same failed strategy of increasing access to VA mental health care and more than 6,000 body bags a year, we will finally spend $180 million on community entities, providing veterans value at the local level. I'm hopeful that congressional appropriation means we are all starting to acknowledge the need to do something drastically different. Over the generations, Congress unintentionally created a VA that rewards disability, messages suicide, fails to provide tangible leadership and training for veterans upon their separation from service, fails to articulate and encourage meaningful, positive goals, and provides no incentive for physical, mental, and financial readiness. Veterans do well when they have a positive group of fellow veterans in their lives, and Congress would do well to increase their support to groups that make this happen. Since at least the Civil War, veterans have joined and organized groups that generally look to serve their fellow veterans in their communities. Veterans seek purpose. We seek meaning. AMVET's motto is Veterans Serving Veterans. AMVET has about 1,200 posts across the nation. For 77 years, AMVET has committed itself to take care of our fellow veterans, our troops, our families, and our communities. Today's service member is no different in this regard. We need to stop focusing so much effort and funding on symptom reduction. Stop being just reactive. Instead, we need to start making significant, proactive investments in the future of our veterans. Let's fuel them with optimistic hope, help them find meaning, and help them become their best selves. Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost, members of this committee, this concludes my statement, and I'm happy to answer any questions you or your members may have.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Schnelly. I now will call on Ms. Strader for 5 minutes for her testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost, and other members of this committee for the opportunity to testify. My name is Sarah Strader. I'm the spouse of an active duty U.S. service member, and I'm the Executive Director of Secure Families Initiative. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit that mobilizes military partners and family members and veterans to be voters and advocates for their communities, especially on issues of national security. The topic of today's hearing has profound importance for our military family community. When a service member or veteran adopts extremist views and resorts to political violence, it's us, their immediate loved ones, who are impacted first. Our safety is put at risk. Our lives are turned upside down. Our loved ones we stand to lose. While on the macro level, the numbers may remain small, our community lives the consequences of these experiences, and we do not have the luxury to ignore or downplay this problem. And so we deeply appreciate this committee for including our voices in these deliberations, as no one is more personally invested in identifying solutions to this real and pressing problem. This morning, I'm going to summarize 4 key points. First, the wartime operational tempo of the last 20 years has contributed to the problem we're tackling today. The post-9/11 wars have had high costs for military families, but our conversations about war and peace rarely acknowledge the extent of these costs, and many veterans and their family members feel afraid to speak up about their lived challenges. Understanding this context is essential for veterans serving institutions like this committee to more effectively relate to their veteran clients. Additionally, foreign policymakers outside this room should also take note of how sending troops into repeated conflicts without clear goals or adequate support systems are breeding grounds for disillusionment and distrust among the people sent on those missions and the loved ones they left behind. Second, the partners and family members of veterans are not only the first impacted by violent extremism, but we can also serve as the first line of defense. Formal, official channels of information will only have so much success on their own. In addition to considering direct interventions, like training transitioning veterans on digital literacy to detect extremist recruitment efforts online, for example, this committee should also invest in training veteran partners and family members to identify early risk factors and support our loved ones. Our interpersonal connection to veterans is a distinct value add. Equip the willing to engage the unwilling. Third, voting and other forms of civic engagement provide peaceful alternatives to political violence. Because the military lifestyle can make it hard for service members to vote or participate in other aspects of civic life, it's not surprising when transitioning veterans feel discouraged or confused about how to address their concerns through civic engagement. People are more likely to resort to extreme tactics when they don't feel they have any other choice. This committee should support efforts that clearly define the voting and civic engagement activities available to veterans, both during and after their service. Because we all want veterans and their families to be able to fully participate in their First Amendment rights and the democratic institutions they serve to protect. Fourth, SFI stands ready to partner on this issue. In our written testimony, we laid out examples of how Secure Families Initiative, or SFI, approaches peer-to-peer civics education, and it is my hope that our work and the work of other non-governmental partners can continue to inform this committee's strategies. I thank this committee for hosting this important hearing. The issue at hand is real and urgent, and no one cares more about supporting our veterans than us, their families.
Thank you, Ms. Strader. Without objection, the written testimony of our second panel witnesses will be included in the hearing record. So I now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I'll begin my questioning with Mr. Buckley. Mr. Buckley, it goes without, I'm just so blown away by your courage, and I'm inspired by the new mission that you've embraced for your life. It truly is inspiring. So I want you to know that, and welcome to your first time to testify before Congress. Since the focus of this hearing is the importance of peer support in preventing and responding to domestic violent extremism, I'd like to ask you about the peer support you received over the course of your personal journey. Tell me about the role your wife played and the role another former white supremacist played in convincing you to step away from the life of racism, homophobia, and anti-immigrant hatred.
Chairman Takano, thank you for your question. Invaluable. My wife is, as was stated previously, the first line of defense against the issues that I was suffering from. I drug her through the mud, I drug my family through the mud, and I drug my country through the mud. It became a shame issue. The more ashamed I was of myself and the things that had happened to me, the more angry I got that I was unable to provide the services that I needed. I blamed the homosexual community for what had happened to me. I blamed the Muslim community for the things that happened to me. I blamed my fellow countrymen for being tossed to the wayside in my time of need. I spiraled down the rabbit hole of addiction, as so many other veterans do, and I used addiction as my attempt at suicide because I was too scared to take my life in another manner. The fact that my wife reached out to another former was invaluable because that former didn't address my ideology initially. He addressed my substance abuse, which we also share in common. And once I was able to gain a sober mind, a sober heart was easy to follow. And I had a very real, organic, and natural relationship built with this individual by that point. I think that the value of peer support and other services that are veteran-operated, former extremist-operated, and contributed to are invaluable. And just like we equip our soldiers to go into combat with the best possible equipment, we should equip our organizations on the front line of dealing with violent extremism amongst our veteran community with the very best equipment. And I think that formers and soldiers are the best possible equipment.
Well, thank you for that. And I note, I just want to reiterate, you're saying in your testimony that your first encounter with the intervention, specifically with Arnold Michaelis, was not about changing your beliefs, but about being challenged on the addictions. And that confronting the addictions led to your later question about the beliefs you had, but they weren't trying to change your beliefs at first. I'm interested in this concept of hate and extremism functioning like a drug addiction. And I'm wondering what that says about how this problem should be confronted. So go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Takano. So in the beginning of getting involved in this intervention work, I asked a question to several people, addiction counselors, other clinicians that I knew. Is it possible to be addicted to the idea of justice seeking and retribution, retaliation, just as much as it is to be addicted to substances? Nobody could tell me no, but nobody could tell me yes. I then inherited that burden of finding the answer. In the studies, I found that the same sections of our brain, such as our nucleus accumbens and our amygdala and other parts of our brain that activate during substance abuse, are also activated during the release of revenge cravings. Make it very possible for the addiction to transfer over. And it's even higher possibility amongst people who already have a substance abuse disorder. That being said, I decided that it was time to create a program that addresses extremism and ideology. It's the same way we do addictions. And we created the Trauma and Recovery Program. It's a moral cognizant approach led by veterans, clinicians, and mental health experts and peer support counselors to deal with the traumas and the issues that veterans suffer. And while this is a very small portion of the veteran community, as it was stated before, one veteran in the wrong mindset can do a great deal of damage.
Thank you so much. My time is up. I'm going to call on Ranking Member Bost for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chanley, your opening statement is absolutely correct, and the vast majority of veterans are not violent extremists in any way, shape, or form. Though we want to be able to focus and help where we can, the question I have, do you believe that it damages the veteran community to focus so closely through multiple committee meetings on the very small population for the larger population's sake?
Thank you, Ranking Member. That has certainly been a concern of ours, that this would bring back damaging stigma by perpetuating, magnifying a few bad apples. That said, this is certainly an issue that we as an organization have considerable effort toward addressing internally, and we'll continue to work with other partners as well, including with we the veterans from the first panel here. We're committed to ensuring that we meet our responsibilities in making it clear that it really is a few bad apples and that we need to address this as a community.
So, Mr. Chanley, same way with AMVETS has been a long leading voice on the needs to improve mental health and suicide prevention by veterans. You know, I think you and I both believe the VA has been missing the mark on this tremendously. I also believe that we both are concerned that the number of veterans who died by suicide remains as high as it is, despite as much tension as we focused on that. How do you think we can fix that?
We've been pounding the drum for years now, before this committee, before the Senate committee, and with the last few administrations, about thinking outside the box, becoming innovative. We have proposed more than just rhetoric, though. This is about working with our community agencies, organizations, groups at the most local levels possible. Those who actually know their veterans, where our veterans live, where our veterans work. Nobody understands the challenges as well as they do. Certainly none of us in Washington know to that extent. We've seen positive efforts from Congress here in the last few years. They're still falling short. But as I'd indicated in our testimony, we're hopeful that this is a sign of moving forward and understanding that the VA cannot do this on their own.
Thank you. Mr. Buckley, I want to thank you for sharing your story here today. And, I commend you. I commend your wife for doing the hard work to get yourself to a better place. and lead the way to other veterans who may be struggling like you. As the saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So what could Department of Defense or VA have done better to prevent the trauma and pain from manifesting itself through and driving you towards the membership of KKK?
Ranking Member Boss, thank you for that question. It's very important that I be very clear and honest. Throughout my time in the service, a lot of traumas, a lot of experiences that hurt. I'm reminded of when I was deployed to go to Afghanistan. It took me 6 months to go through pre-mob at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. That was my entire battalion to get mission ready, checks in the boxes, everything in order. When I come home from Afghanistan, I was on my couch drinking beer with my buddies in 2 weeks. That size frame is considerably inappropriate. We have a program at Parents for Peace that I would love to share with the Department of Defense, the members of Congress, the Veterans Affairs Committee, to help implement in that downtime when soldiers are brought back. We can utilize that time that they are on FOB or on the base doing their demob in the evenings to give them tools while they're already being paid and on the clock. So we wouldn't have to bring them in after they get home. I think that there's a lot that we can talk about. This program's amazing. And unlike other programs that have gotten a lot of funding from DHS, Parents for Peace gets zero. We fund these programs ourselves and through generous donors. Yet we are the ones who are bringing solutions to Congress instead of data. And thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you. My time is running short, but I do want to thank you and the other witnesses for being here. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Boss, for that question. I want to thank the more senior Democratic members for allowing me to call on Mr. Gallego to allow him to get to a speech. But Mr. Gallego, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleagues for letting me jump. First of all, Mr. Buckley, brother, everything you said, I felt when I lost my friends, and I understand what you, where you came from, where you're going, and I'm very proud of you. It was tough. It just struck me right now when you said I had a pre-mob of at least, I think, 3.5 months, and when I got back, they kicked us right out. Cut off our contracts. People had no places to live. They're very quick to get us to war, but as soon as they don't need us, they just threw us to the streets. And I know that feeling. I'm sorry that you had to go to that. And I think everyone here is sorry that we have done that to our fellow veterans, our brothers, people that we say are warriors, but then we treat them as just a budget item when it comes to giving them the housing that they need when they get back from deployment, or just even if they need any care. And God knows, like, especially my unit, we had a tough time even getting to VA back in the day. So I love you, brother. Very, very proud of you. And, honestly, I was supposed to have a question here and that, but I think I just want to make that statement. And, I think you're doing great work. Everything you've seen, I've seen and felt. And there's a lot of veterans out there, and you at least have the courage to talk about it, to do something about it. I just want you to know that. Ms. Joanne, I want to ask you about what interventions, in your experience, are the most effective for veterans who have already been radicalized or fallen within an extremist group online or in person. The veterans who attacked the Capitol on January 6th were already very deep with false ideology. What's the best way to provide off-ramps for veterans at that point?
So, apologies. Thank you for your question. The work that we do at Parents for Peace is mostly focused on the family and loved ones and people that can act as pillars and mentors, because we do believe, as Sarah was mentioning earlier, that families can play this role and can really be the way in order to use the emotional link and the social connections. We see that radicalization happens the further isolated you are, and that's what isolation and a sense of abandonment is what a lot of veterans suffer from when coming back. And we try to use the family as a way in, and something that we also really touch on when we try to coach the family first, without even going to the veterans when they reach out to us, is trying to educate people on what extremism is. using the addiction analogy, perceiving extremism and as a form of addiction, perceiving hate as a drug of choice, and trying to explain that people don't necessarily go to extremism because they care about the content, because they care about the ideology, but more because of what it does to them, how it numbs the pain, how it's a way to, how cathartic it can be to people. And so using those educational resources and really training and educating is really the way in for the families to then be able to have a toolbox to intervene directly and be the ones that are equipped in order to actually show up, because they're going to be around, they're going to be exposed to everyday extremism and to everyday hate. And so having them be equipped in order to address this is extremely important, and that's the most success that we've seen so far.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gallego, and appreciate your questioning. Ms. Brownlee, the chairwoman of our Health Subcommittee. Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here. And, I want to associate myself with all of the other comments that members have made, Mr. Buckley, in terms of, thank you. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your tenacity in terms of going through the experience that you have been through and then wanting to translate that into helping others. So we're very, very grateful. I'm very much just interested in, beyond the testimony that you made. I'm interested in really two things. One, since you left the military, since you were going through what you were going through, did you use any VA resources during that time, or was it all, NGOs, nonprofits, community, wife, family, community, etc.?
Congresswoman, I'm very thankful for that question. I'm reminded of a time when I was at my lowest point, and I drove 6 hours from my home in Georgia to Birmingham, Alabama, because I was aware that it was my regional office for VA. I took with me a loaded .38 handgun. I put it in my glove box, and I left my car unlocked in the parking garage at the VA. I walked to the front desk at the emergency room, and I said, if you don't help me relieve what I'm going through, I'm going to kill myself. And I told the lady at the front desk that there's a loaded .38 handgun in the glove box of my vehicle, which parking spot I was in. I said, please don't discharge me 2 hours from now. I was put in a paper gown and forced to sit while another nurse of the opposite sex stared at me without a word for 2 hours until the on-call psychiatrist arrived. I was prescribed 2 more medications and sent home. When I got to my vehicle, I opened the glove box, and right where I had left it was that .38 handgun, bullets intact. They never left their desk to check. I could have been one of the 22 a day. That discredited the VA for me, and I never went back. Since then, I've been aware of a lot of programs that the VA offers and a lot of services, but I challenge you to find them. They're on paper, but they're not available.
Well, I hear you on that, and again, it's the story that you tell about going to the VA when you're in desperate need and desperate help and not receiving it. We continue to work on that. Suicide is a huge priority of this committee, and we'll keep at it. The other area that I'm interested in is I just want to hear a little bit more about your intervention experiences. And so, how does that come to be? Are you, are people coming to Parents for Peace and then you get connected with them? Or are you actually reaching out and, doing an intervention on a particular person?
So it's a little bit of both. Normally, Parents for Peace will receive an intake call from a family member or a loved one who is concerned, and Emma does that intake, and it's very in-depth with psycho-bio intake. I'm learning new words. And then she will, send that case out to one of the clinicians and one or more of the interventionists, as well as anybody else who might be able to help that person throughout our network of resources that we've compiled over the long time that we've been doing this. I'm also a bit of a trailblazer, and I like to be proactive instead of and I do troll a lot of online groups that have a tendency for extremism and radicalization. And whenever I have the opportunity, I do single a person out and try to plant the seeds. And that has been very effective to date. I can think of several people, without throwing their name out there, that I have helped leave the grooming process of violent extremism, Islamism, eco-terrorism, Antifa, white supremacy. There's not one broad, it's all extremism. And in that, it's just who I am, and that's the way I work.
So you're saying that in terms of your proactivity and your outreach, you're outreaching to people online and actually succeeding and getting them to walk away with the groups that they're associated with.
Absolutely. In the military, we use a term called TTPs. The enemy will adjust their tactics and training procedures, and in turn, we adjust our training and tactic procedures. It's just something I was trained to do, and I see that the online space is being utilized, and that's why Parents for Peace and our partners are very involved with online services, helpline, and access to ourselves as interventionists. I mean, we don't make ourselves inaccessible. Just last week, I had 2 people reach out to me online self-identifying as needing help with de-radicalization or leaving the extremist ideology.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Brownlee, for your questions. I just want all members to know, and all those offices that may be listening in on behalf of the members, that I do intend to go through a second round. We have such incredible witnesses, and I want to give them all a chance to maybe make a contribution today. I'm devastated, Mr. Buckley, that you had that experience at a VA. We have enacted a law that, it's an Access Act to really improve VA's emergency care for suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation. And I wish they had, I wish that the law that we passed together and got signed into law in the last session of Congress, which will allow a veteran to call the crisis line and get evaluated and immediately get referred to mental health care, either inpatient or outpatient, and not have to worry about paying for it. So I wish that had been there for you. We've also increased mental health services for rural veterans specifically. And Ranking Member Boss, I didn't mean to leave you off the Strong Act, but Ranking Member Boss is a co-sponsor of that bill. We've been working with the Four Corners, and I didn't mean to be flip, but I'm hoping that we can get this to the floor as soon as we get a cost back. But I realize it. But you know what? I believe that we got to put our veterans first, and I'm not so worried about the cost. And I'm not saying that the minority in that particular case, I didn't want to mischaracterize them, but Ranking Member Boss and I are together on trying to improve mental health services for our veterans. And again, I'm just horrified that that experience happened to you, and I'm pretty sure it's happened to others. With that, I'm going to call on Mr. Lamb for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chairman for having this hearing. This may not be a problem that we want to talk about, but you would have to have been blind on January 6th not to notice the prevalence of veterans and military logos in that crowd. The fact has been repeated many times here today of a quadrupling in incidents involving veterans. And so in the same way that we talk about suicide, even though the vast majority of veterans do not commit suicide, we have to talk about this problem. And it is nothing unusual for veterans to both protect their own and police their own. It's something that we do on active duty every single day. There is a small number of people who don't meet the standard, commit crimes against the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and it is dealt with. This is the same thing. and that is not to equate all problems of mental health with all problems of extremism. They're not the same, but there are clearly common factors that have been discussed here today. So I'm happy that we're shining some sunlight on this problem and that we have benefited from the testimony of such great witnesses. Mr. Buckley, I would like to ask you something more in the spirit of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You must remember what it was like to have been an E1 or an E2 at the beginning of your service, idealistic, probably happy to be wearing the uniform, excited about what was to come. I'd like you to talk a little bit about what you think it might have been like if you would have met your current self back then, if there had been some sort of official briefing or training that you had to take part in, where someone could have warned you that these groups are out there opportunistically seeking veterans for membership. In your case, it was the KKK, but just as commonly, we see a group like the Oath Keepers, which holds events in VSO posts in some parts of the country, which specifically targets military and law enforcement people because of the skills that they have, and which played an enormous role on January 6th, for which the head of the Oath Keepers has now been indicted for seditious conspiracy. These groups are serious and they want to grow. They want to get bigger and stronger over time. And so as we all grapple with what to do about that, I think one thing, it would be helpful if you could tell us practically maybe what it would have been like for you to hear this while you were on active duty, either at the beginning or at the end when you returned from deployment, and what, if any, messages you think might have made a difference at that point.
Thank you, Mr. Lamb. I think it would have been a game changer in terms of maybe the briefings before. The military holds mandatory briefings around extremism, radicalization, ideologies, things of that nature. So it is talked about. It's talked about prior to, but it needs to be talked about on the back end. I feel like, although I didn't really fall deep into my extremism ideology until I left service, as odd as it sounds, there was a conflict about my oath of enlistment and becoming involved in other organizations. But it was the fact that I didn't have that ability to know what was going to happen to me when I left the military. I thought everything was going to be great. And I guess I always remained an idealist, even to this day. I have the idea that our country can come together and avoid political extremism that we see today, where it's completely acceptable for somebody to look at a member of an opposite party and call them a libtard or a Democrat or Republicans, white supremacists and extremists. It's unacceptable. We're Americans. And let
me ask you, have you ever been invited in to speak to a group of active duty service members or reservists?
No, sir, I have not.
Although that's the kind of thing we need to change. That's really what we need to change, and that's what we're going to work on. But I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing, because it's never going to be more powerful than hearing it first person. Your idealism is something that we want to preserve and protect. I'm glad that you have it. We need more of it, and it's what these groups prey on. They distort the meaning of the oath. That's the problem. The people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, many of them believed genuinely that they were doing the right thing for the country. They were not, but they were lied to over a long period of time by people who were using them and their oath for some other purpose. And that's where we have to interfere and kind of get left of the boom and prevent that all from happening. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Lamb. I now call on Mr. Mervan for 5 minutes.
Mr. Buckley, I want to again thank you for your courage and your ability to be able to discuss these issues, and for putting the time and effort in helping others and advocating for others so they don't go through what you went through and trying to advocate for change. With that, I'd like to dive into the details a little bit on the personal journey a bit more. How were you first introduced to extremist or white supremacist ideas?
It was accidental, to say the best. When when I come home from the military, I didn't have an idea of whether I was a Republican or a Democrat. I barely had an idea of what kind of social agendas were out there. I just knew that I was a soldier, and the military doesn't have room for politics. When I come home, my country was unrecognizable. I was immediately attempted to be put in a box. I was pro-life or pro-choice. I was a Republican or I was a Democrat. There was so many opportunities to be placed in a box, and I just didn't have the answers. And I remember, just in joking, I Googled, how do I protect the white race? Because everybody was so hyper-focused on refugees and everything else that I felt like maybe I should, click up with my own people. Very tribalistic. You have to understand, I'm from rural America, and urban America is completely different. It's two separate Americas. The rural Americans that I know every day are angry that they're living in poverty, they can't find jobs, they can't find education assistance, yet we spend billions of dollars on immigration and assets towards refugees. That's not my words, that's theirs. I think that during the course of typing that in, I seen, the Ku Klux Klan pop up as one of the top 3 search results. I clicked on the website, and I just wanted to hear what the guy had to say. And it started off as a joke and ended up very real. And at one point in time, I was the Imperial Nighthawk, which is second in command for the entire loyal white knights of the Ku Klux Klan for the entire United States.
My next question would be, did you experience any difficulties? Well, you already said this. Help me out when you talk about the rural area and the inability to find a job. So I want to circle back to what the VA offers and what the DoD offers as far as workforce development and any opportunities that they provided for you to be trained or to transition into the workforce. And now looking back, what do you think should be prioritized in that transition?
It's a very complex issue. It is not just what do we need to prioritize more, what do we prioritize less. It's the fact that rural Americans, such as myself, are 85 miles from my nearest veterans hospital and my VA center. The fact that I'm having trouble finding a job, the increase in rent, not to mention the cost of gas, makes it impossible to get to these places, to enroll, to take these classes. That's just the way things are right now, and I don't think it's anybody's fault.
I guess what I want to hone in on, I know one experience that there is and I don't know the name of it, but there's a program that allows, while you are transitioning out of the DoD or out of active duty, that you can do internships or you can work. Were those offered to you or communicated to you? Did you have access to them?
Sir, my unit was so incompetent that I broke my back in a vehicle accident and was issued workers' comp instead of a line of duty incident report. So no, they were not. I didn't know anything about them until year and a half after I exited training and service.
So I guess I want to just, last question, with the transition, what would you change?
I would take some of the extra time that we have at demobilization stations, and I would implement people such as myself and other veterans and spousal advocates and family advocates to take time to go to these bases, talk to these soldiers returning home, let them know what's really out there, not just thanks for coming, welcome home, and go drink some beer. Like, this is what's going to happen. You're going to face challenges. And just give them the tools they need when they leave. Soldiers are resilient, but there are a handful of us who fall victim. And those are the ones that we focus on. The rest of them can take what they need and leave the rest.
Thank you very much. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mervan, for your questions. Ms. Sherfilis McCormick, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I first want to start off by saying thank you so much, Mr. Buckley, for your testimony. It's brave of you to be here to tell us what you're going through and give us a different perspective. My first question is for Ms. Juni. How do people typically find their way to Parents for Peace? And how often does a radicalized individual themselves reach out versus outreach by friends or family members who is concerned about their loved ones?
Thank you very much for your question. So most people actually reach out to us via our helpline. So we have a helpline that's available Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., where we have first responders. And so anyone can reach out to us, call us, and then we undertake this whole intervention protocol. Most people, when we ask, actually find us by typing keywords online. So extremism, worried, family, radicalization. We also have cases that are being referred in the pre-criminal case phase by the FBI or other law enforcement agencies. We've had cases being referred by the Department of Justice, by the U.S. Probation Office. We've had cases being referred as well by schools, psychologists, social workers, a lot of those people being exposed to extremism. And regarding the data, I don't have the exact number, but I would say that most of the cases that we have are being referred to by a family member rather than a self-referral.
In what ways do you work to equip friends and family members with the tools they need to prevent radicalization or intervene on the behalf of the loved one?
Thank you for your question. So the intervention protocol really can be divided into 4 different phases. The first one would be the educational phase, where we make sure that the caller and the person that is going to act as a mentor is understanding and educated on the issue of extremism, what it looks like, what it is, how it works from a sociological, neurological point of view and perspective, and making sure that they understand how it can act as an addiction and what it does to the brain. And then once that phase is finished, we equip them with what we call a toolbox. So actually concrete activities, dialogues, role plays, letters, way to engage that they can undertake. And then eventually we have the direct intervention of former extremists like Chris or Mubin, that do those direct interventions in order to use their insider experience to explain a bit better to families, but also sometimes to the individual concerned what is really happening.
Thank you so much. My next question is for Ms. Strader. This seems similar to the work that you do for Secure Families, for the Secure Families Initiative. Why is building resiliency around someone who is at risk of extremism an important approach to take?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And yes, the programs that we offer are compatible with many of the other NGO partners who have presented today. We focus on the inoculation end of the spectrum, taking after ranking members' comments about prevention being worth a pound of cure. We focus on getting folks on a track of positive and peaceful civic engagement. So voter registration education, how do you cast a ballot when you're deployed overseas, for example, and that affects family members as well. So helping the entire family unit know how they can make their voice heard at the ballot box. We also do civics trainings on politics do's and don'ts for military partners, knowing ways that they can raise their voice without running afoul of what DoD regulations exist. And finally, we also do a tough conversations training. So how do you, the invested loved one of a veteran you see who may be struggling and who may be exposed to the extremist ideologies that have been described, how do you have a constructive relationship-building conversation about something you fundamentally disagree on without having it blow up and you go to opposite ends of the room? I think that the skill required to hold disagreement is probably something we could all use, but it's certainly relevant in this situation as well. To your point of building resilience, we don't want to sever those relationship ties. Those relationships can be key to bringing someone back from the brink. We want to invest in strengthening those relationships by equipping with really tangible conversational models.
And I have this last question really quick. What do you tell military families and other people in the military who feel uncomfortable about approaching this situation, this issue?
We lead by example, creating a sense of community. You are not the only one who sees these concerns and who wants to speak out about specifically the prevalence of white supremacy within the ranks as one of the leading problems that the data shows is growing. We're here for you and we're here together. And I think that that can provide a lot of confidence building so an individual doesn't have to go out on their own.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Sherfilis McCormick. We'll now go to a second round of questioning. I'd like to, and then I'll take 5 minutes. Ms. Strader, I'm interested in how you see civic engagement as an antidote to anti-government extremism, and whether that's encouraging, whether that engagement means encouraging voter participation or getting people to volunteer as poll workers. Each of you can talk a bit, each of you on the panel can talk a bit about why civic engagement is an important approach for the organizations you lead.
Thank you for the opportunity to elaborate on that point. In 2020, the Federal Voting Assistance Program found that there was a 27% deficit in voter participation amongst military voters compared to their civilian counterparts, even when controlling for demographics. There are many reasons for this voter participation deficit, but a large contributing factor are the difficulties that service members face when attempting to cast their ballot, especially when in an overseas location. And so it's not surprising when someone exits their term of military service feeling frustrated and giving up on something like voting as a viable method of raising their voice on issues that they care about. Similarly, that there are boundaries about political activities, boundaries that belong in place, to be sure, for service members, so as to not partisanize the DoD. But being able to train someone in the transition, once you're out of military service, you have new First Amendment activities you can participate in, and setting them on a track where there's this sense of positive impact that one can have that doesn't require extreme tactics, that doesn't require violence. That is the importance of emphasizing voting and civic engagement. And I think, if I may also comment, it requires leadership from the top. It requires our members of Congress demonstrating government's ability to work for people who are petitioning the government and asking for support and resources. And so when acting in bipartisan manners, in productive manners, in eschewing election-based misinformation, all of those are signs that we need from our leaders so that people do not become discouraged and do not give up on the process entirely.
Well, thank you for that response. Mr. Schinelli, you know, I know I've interacted with you before, but I've never read your bio aloud, and my, what an impressive service record you have. So I just want to begin by saying thank you for your service to our country. And thank you for your testimony as well. Now, I understand that AMVETS conducted a stand-down of sorts following the events of January 6th, and that there have been efforts at the post level to make clear that violent extremist conduct has no place in the organization that you lead. Can you tell me what has that effort entailed?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for those kind words. We saw this as an immediate need. We see this as a very damaging, to the veteran community, but to the individual veteran as well, of course. So our governing documents, they're 77 years old, have spelled out clearly that working against our government, working against democracy is unacceptable and has no place within our organization. So immediately after the January 6th event, we put out a statement publicly and sent it out to all of our posts and all of our state level departments that anyone found to have participated in those activities in a criminal way would not be welcome to the organization and would need to be removed from the organization immediately. We put a great deal of effort over the really up on, including now, as we continue to monitor it, to seek out anything along those lines to ensure that extremism is not in our organization. I'm happy to be able to say we have not found anyone within our ranks still at this time. We've also sent out periodic messages. Our national leadership makes many visits to our posts all across the country, practically every weekend, and that's a message they've carried with them as well.
Well, thank you for that, and I congratulate you on that work. Are there any specific examples you can point to where a post might have changed any practices or policies as a result of what you've done?
Yes, first, I think talking about it is something that's new and maybe renewed, but very valuable. But we've also had most of our posts looked at who they're renting to. There are sometimes other organizations that need rent space or just be given space to use for a monthly meeting in one of our post halls. We've had at least one that I'm aware of where they're once the post leadership understood what our guidance was from the national level, and they took a look at one of the organizations that had been renting space in their hall, and they asked them and let them know that they wouldn't be welcome there anymore at that point. I think that was a positive step and something that we were very thankful for, that post taking that, that difficult decision.
Mr. Schnelly, I have to say that I think you'd be congratulated on the leadership that you and your organization have shown and the example you've set. Mr. Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Schnelly, can you please elaborate on the suggestion that you had about the need to reduce veterans' dependency on disability payments, especially the process that encourages veterans to reach the 100% level?
I'm sorry, Mr. Ranking Member, would you be able to repeat the question?
Yeah. In your testimony, you said that you thought there was a suggestion the need to reduce the veterans' dependency on disability payments, especially the process to encourage them to try to reach the 100% level. Can you expand on that?
Absolutely, and this goes to what we wrote and some of what I said in my opening statement here. The system is largely built on. It encourages and really incentivizes far too many veterans to game the system. I know that's a harsh way to say it, but that's reality. A lot of the most important, most useful benefits that a veteran can qualify for can only be qualified for if they reach a high level of disability, the 100%, right, or 80 or 90%, and then get individual unemployability. And on the inverse side, there's no incentive of getting better. So if it leads many veterans to not make the efforts necessary to be able to recuperate or to be able to find new ways to work through their disabilities. It's not a system that encourages wellness.
So that will lead to my follow-up on that. So what steps should Congress take to encourage veterans to use retaining and employment programs that, instead of veterans relying completely on disability payments, which are vitally important where we can get them, but more to direct them to the most productive life that they can by involved in the workforce?
Right. I laid out a list earlier. Starting off with providing these veterans with leadership, peer-to-peer leadership. I mean, that's in the title of this hearing here, and I think it's very relevant. Providing goals, providing incentives, providing maybe different types of benefits than we provide now, and these benefits not expiring or going away if you do get better. And this could, the financial part, the relationship part. Certainly, physical and mental wellness. Find ways to really help these veterans just get better instead of just incentivizing their suffering.
And just kind of shifting gears again here, but you also said in your statement that your statement claims that you believe numerous nonprofits will forgo suicide prevention grant funding opportunity that Congress provided in the Hannon Act. What is that belief based on, and how can we course correct so that more organizations take advantage of this opportunity?
Sure, this is very disappointing, but very important. This is from direct feedback from some of the best organizations out there, the ones that we really were hoping would be able to increase their services offered through this legislation or through this act, that we were very grateful and have worked very hard with this committee to be able to get through. First, it took 2 years for the implementation of the program to begin. And now what we're seeing is that the application process and then the requirements are extremely burdensome, wrapped in red tape, calling for standards that the VA itself is not held to. And the feedback we're getting from these organizations, and to be clear, it's not AMVETS, we're not applying for these types of things. But the organizations that are, they're finding and reporting to us that it's largely not worth it at this point, which again, very disappointing. And my hope here is that the VA will be able to revisit this. Unfortunately, that takes time, and we've already, as I said, taken 2 years on this. That's just totally unacceptable.
Thank you for that. And with my last few seconds here, I want to just say to Mr. Buckley, let me tell you that your story about going to the VA and receiving the inadequate treatment that you received, and look, it is our committee's job to make sure that people don't have that experience. Unfortunately, it's too often that they do. And each one of us that sat on this panel have heard it in our districts. And we're trying to argue on not only your behalf, but every veteran out there, that the service that they receive at the VA should be a quality service, and that each person that works at the VA understands that they're serving the veteran, not self. Serving veteran above self. And that we need to, and also then to encourage those because of whatever reason that do not seek help from the VA, that they actually seek that help from the VA. With that, I'm over on my time. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Chairwoman Brownlee, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First thing that I want to say is, you know, in the first panel today, there was a witness that talked about we need to develop more off-ramps. And it's just dawned on me in this hearing. When she first said that, I was thinking to myself, what are some of these off-ramps? But it has just dawned on me that all three of you are the off-ramp. So I just first and foremost want to thank each and every one of you for what you are doing every single day for our veteran community. And Ms. Joeen and Ms. Strader, I haven't been diving into questions with you, but I really recognize the good work that you do. And Ms. Strader, too, we always thank the service person for their service to our country, but we also thank their loved ones and their families for their service to their country, which I thank you for that. And I thank you for extending that to so many more families within your community. So it's very much appreciated and certainly recognized by all of us. So thank you for that. Mr. Buckley, I wanted to get back to you one more time. First, the one thing I wanted to say to you too is in your testimony when you talked about you were never given a line of duty determination. This is a big issue within the Department of Defense that needs to be clarified. These lines are really, 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 really murky. They need to be more clear. There needs to be better transparency on this. A line of duty determination includes both physical and mental experiences that may cause huge duress. And it seems to me that certainly the damage caused to you in Afghanistan should have been considered, a line of duty determination, but then to come home and drive an Army vehicle and break your back, it's like you're driving an Army vehicle and breaking your back and doing what you were told to do, and then is not considered a line of determination, and then you have to go off and get workers' compensation. It just makes no sense to me. And I have another family in my own district that I'm working with, and we're sort of working on this issue because of some of his situation. So I just want to assure you that we're focused on that as well. What I again wanted to drill down a little bit further, just in terms of your intervention. So I'm just, I'm curious to know, I guess it sounds to me your online experiences were relatively, I want to put in the category of easy. Maybe that's not the right category, but comparatively so. And it seemed it was over a shorter period of time. And my sense is that this takes a long time, of intervention and conversation and inquiry and getting to know someone and sharing your own experiences and, all that takes to kind of bring somebody to a place where they're actually even willing and open to look at a new idea. So tell me about some of tell me about some of those interventions when you're in a room with somebody or at a bar with somebody. I don't know where this takes place, but describe to me a little bit more what it's like.
Thank you, ma'am. It's revisiting their trauma, and it's acknowledging their grievances and their traumas and their issues that they're experiencing. One of the veterans I worked with was devastated because he found out he had heart disease due to some dental issues that he was facing. But in order to receive dental services at the VA, you have to be 100% disabled. That needs to change.
I do have a bill on that.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for that. But it's humanizing the individual, building an organic relationship. Nobody's going to listen to you because you tell them to. You have to lead by the example. And the members at this table have dedicated their life to being that example. And I'm just thankful to be sitting beside such amazing individuals. It's an honor and a privilege.
Well, again, to all three of you, to the AMVET witness as well, really thank you for the service you're providing to our nation's veterans, and my deepest gratitude, and I really recognize the fact of what you have said, that the VA has all of these services that may or may not be effective. We always say here on this dais, if you've seen one VA, you've seen one VA, because there are pockets of real success across the country, but we can't scale that up. That seems to be always to be the challenge. But we need to do a better job of supporting organizations like you, who are on the ground in your communities doing the work that you're doing. And we have veterans come in time and time again testifying in front of us that talk about those people in their community that saved their lives. So thank you for that, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. And with that, I thank you for my overtime, and I yield back.
Well, Ms. Brownlee, I certainly do thank you for the amount of time you've devoted today to this topic. And members are busy, but I'm very grateful that you as chair of the Health Committee were here to take in all this. Mr. Mervan, I call on you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Jonet, my question to you is, you had mentioned in your testimony about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Effects Study, and the vulnerabilities that veterans have, primarily through PTSD. If you can link those past experiences towards how that links towards behavior with extremists, and how you tailor that into your program to assist those individuals, how is that data helpful to you to understand that background? And do you have any suggestions how the VA can start looking at things like that to maybe be a predictor of people who may need more help when it comes to mental health?
Thank you very much for your question. So we got to this conclusion by both analyzing data from actual interviews with former extremists, trying to understand what led them, why did they get involved into an extremist group? What was it that extremism provided in the first place? But also by collecting data from all the cases that we've had on the helpline, which is hundreds and hundreds of families coming to us and explaining what happened. And with this data, we're able to see that we call those unaddressed grievances and vulnerabilities, create just pockets that can be, that just are quite void and need filling into an individual, and that an extremist group does provide this. And knowing and understanding that, understanding how this vulnerability exists and needs to be redirected, because very often we see anger, resentment, sadness, solitude, and those need to be fixed and healed in order for someone to be living the best possible life that they can. And so using those, we are able to provide support that is tailored to the individual, trying to figure out what are the roots of the trauma, trying to figure out what are the roots of the grievances. And once we're able to analyze and identify those, then we can provide alternative solutions to be it for, if it's a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a need for brotherhood. And so knowing those, being able to properly diagnose what is happening and what the issue is, we're able to provide solutions. And I think one of the efforts that could deserve more attention is being able to effectively identify the issue. Today we see that extremism has been widely misunderstood. It's been instrumentalized politically again and again, but using that public health approach really enables us to say, okay, well, if a sense of purpose and a need for structure is what you apparently are looking for into extremism, then we can provide you alternative with civic engagement, for example. If it's a sense of brotherhood, we can find peer-to-peer support for you to engage in, and really making sure that we have those alternatives ready and available as well.
And if I can switch to Mr. Buckley, was it that lack of mission and that lack of brotherhood that led you, or you believe had that connection to the extremist groups that you turned to?
Sir, I've thought about that question since I left the movement. And I think that a soldier will always create his war. It's what we do. We fight. I just chose the wrong war. I was misled, and I was taken advantage of, and I allowed that to happen. But when I separated from service, the military kept moving right on without me. And after about 6 months, I wasn't talking to any of my comrades. And I was empty. I was alone. I miss them to this day. And I think it's very important to find that productive mission for our soldiers. Because anybody who's been in the military remembers how much crazy drama an E1 through an E4 can get into when left unattended. That happens to our veterans when left unattended. Not every E4 is a problem, but there's a couple. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And in closing, I just want to state to you, thank you both, or all four of you, for what you've done, what you do to advocate for families, to be able to find peace. And as a member of Congress and on the VA committee, I take very seriously to make sure that the veterans continue, hopefully through the VA and through our efforts, to find a mission within our country that is peaceful and unifying. And I thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Mervan. I just want to ask if there's any member who might be virtually on with us, or any other member here who wishes to ask anything else. And if I don't hear anything, I'm going to just go ahead and say thank you to our second panel. All of the witnesses, all four of you, I'd like to thank you for your attendance at today's hearing. Your testimony was, most illuminating and touching. And I'd like to recognize the ranking member for any closing remarks that he may have.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to say thank you to the witnesses as well. I think the hearing today was very good, and the stories and the information that we received, vitally important. But I also want to end with, when I opened, I was concerned about the political partisanship I feel that has been happening. I really think that we showed today that we don't have to go down that path. Now, I also believe that we need to, it is beneath us as leaders not to make sure we stay away, or we as leaders should stay away from that path. And also that our staff should. We need to work together. We need to make sure, because our veterans deserve it. So let's start, if we can, anew, working together in that way and solving problems. I do want to bring up the fact that Congress, some of the issues we talked about today, Congresswoman Mace and I have a bill, H.R. 2326, the Veterans Cyber Risk Awareness Act. Our bill would help get at some of the information we needed about this risk the veterans face online from fraud, disinformation, and violent extremism. And it would require the VA to help equip veterans with information they need to stay safe. The bill is widely supported by VSOs and has already had a legislative hearing. It is the only bill that I'm aware of that would take actionable steps to address that number of veterans that we see who are vulnerable to the violent extremism. So there's a full committee markup next week. I'm very, very serious that I hope that we'll put the Veteran Cyber Risk Awareness Act on that markup, and that we'll pass it on to the House floor. And Mr. Chairman, I hope you'll support us with that. And with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost. And let me just say I want to thank all of our panelists. And I think, Mr. Buckley, your presence here and your open-heartedness and your testimony brought out some of the better angels of our nature on this committee. I think you've opened up more space for us to work with one another. I think there were suspicions that this was going to be a partisan exercise, and I think having gotten through this, you and all the witnesses today have shined a light on a hopeful path. Yours is a hopeful story. You went in as a true warrior on behalf of America to fight our enemies, and you've, I think, now found a mission for yourself, which is truly bigger than you, and a noble mission, and an honorable mission, and an important mission. I see the biggest danger to America. You know, we see a threat right now in Europe, and we have threats all around us, and some, you know, many people are focused on China, but I'd say the biggest threat is the disunity among ourselves and the perilous place we find our democracy in. And some of it has been stoked, much of it's been stoked by people outside the country. They've taken advantage of this division. So we can become a stronger America. You've helped us become a stronger America today. And so I with all humility, thank you for being here today. I'm very emotionally moved by, I think we all were. So you've all helped us put into context the various factors that place a small but growing number of veterans at risk of radicalization. But you've helped us understand radicalization in general. Maybe give us a new way to talk about it, a new language to